clarify something for me. Isn't the point of a communal meal the exchange of ideas and opinions, an opportunity to consider important issues of the day?
It is. You just kind of put a damper on things when you said, the next person I see talking with food in their mouth will be put to death.
Well, we could argue about who said what all night long, but to set things back on course, I will propose a new topic of conversation.
Oh, great.
What is the best number? By the way, there's only one correct answer.
5,318,008?
Wrong. The best number is 73. You're probably wondering why.
No, we're good.
73 is the 21st prime number. Its mirror, 37, is the 12th. And its mirror, 21, is the product of multiplying, hang on to your hats, 7 and 3. Did I lie?
We get it. 73 is the Chuck Norris of numbers.
Chuck Norris wishes. In binary, 73 is a palindrome, 1001,001, which backwards is 1001,001. Exactly the same. All Chuck Norris backwards gets you is Ciron Cook.
Just for the record, when you enter 5,318,008 in a calculator, upside down, it spells boobies.
Remember when you were wondering why the girls didn't want to eat with us tonight?
Yeah, I get it now.
Hello. Alright, so, I guess I'm going to talk about 73, because this post, I didn't really realize, once again, when I wrote it, that it would be 73, let alone what 73 would come to symbolize, I guess, for me. And, I mean, in general, it's not just for me, but Chokmah or Chokmah as 73, as well as Gimel, it's weird how the symbolism connecting Chesed, which is 72, Chokmah, 73, Gimel, and 74, Lamed, all tie in together in terms of their overall, meaning, being just this whole, initiatory path, I guess, of the spirit. And how do I get into this? I'll start reading it, and I'll just mention whatever I slowly absorbed, I guess, about 73 and contemplating this whole thing with the reading of the urn, the cross of the frog in Liber 415 and 451. So I said yesterday, me and my multiple personalities, read Liber O vel Manus Sagittae, subfigure 6. The instructions given in this book are too loose to find a place in the Class D publications. Instructions given for elementary study of the Kabbalah, assumption of God forms, vibration of divine names, the ritual of pentagram and hexagram, and their uses in protection and invocation, a method of attaining astral visions, so-called, and an instruction in the practice called rising on the plains. I refrained from including the great rituals of the pentagram and hexagrams in video, as they can be modified according to the preferred invocations, but the lesser rituals are performed. As Crowley says, these rituals need not be slavishly imitated. On the contrary, the student should do nothing the object of which he does not understand. Also, if he have any capacity whatever, he will find his own crude rituals more effective than the highly polished ones of other people. If you have kept up with this publication, you will know that 666 is the force of solar energy, which is both within and without. Essentially, the nexus point of the inner and outer world, as termed in Persephone. Internal and external, and the yoga or link between the two. We have already mentioned how 666 is the circle, which manifests throughout the fractal cosmos and signifies this yoga yuga, or unified eon or soul cycle of samsara. This is formulated in the microcosm by the mage in the form of a ceremonial circle. And there's so many other 666s I found relating to, again, the circle, the ritual, and so many aspects of Buddhism. Essentially the Buddha's message, the Buddha's noble silence, the Buddha's spoken word, which a lot of people put a lot of credence more into. But yeah, the Buddha's noble silence and the Buddha's spoken word, the Buddha's message, which kind of implies the two in the middle way, and then the heart and crown of Buddha, which shows the equivalence of 666 as the heart and the crown, because again, this whole circle, or essentially the ring or the halo of the Magus, which I'll get to. So 666 is the key of the ritual circle, and this key unlocks all occult ritual initiations, and the ritual of the cosmic dance itself, of which we are all participants. And so Shiva comes up in many ways, because the Shiva Murtis, the images of Shiva, god of destruction, spelled out to show really the relation between this concept and that god form, I guess. Destruction itself is 666. Cyclical manifestation. So many things, really. The Shiva statue itself and everything else about the labyrinth. Really, there's a lot more, even just like the whole mythology of Shaivism and really Vaishnavism can be understood, because again, Vishnu's avatar, avatar of Vishnu, and then Vishnu Dashavatara, and again the Buddha in Vaishnava Hinduism, Seshanaga, etc., etc. Really, essentially, really showing the sort of, again, the underlying nature of the whole overlay, the fractal overlay. The magical ritual motions, which again, movements in circles from fundamentals of Tai Chi Chuan, are to be designed as a microcosmic reflection or charge, which is to reorientate both the conscious and subconscious sides of the mind toward that of the will. In the pagan and Wiccan traditions, the magic circle is of central importance and is used along with the cone of power. The cone is the union between the circle and the triangle in the spiral. These essential elements can be modified in a limitless number of ways by the mage, master of the circle. So again, master being 315 or 555. There's so many little, the ways in which these nuances or these differences, such as Samek and Shin, Teth and Tau, they only arrange for 2 or 3 or 4 possible variations, but those particular variations interconnect like a puzzle with other concepts that link and make more expressive ideas. And it seems like these relate, in the larger scheme of things outside the circles of time, it seems like there is an algorithmic way in which things come together. But 666 as O of the Magus, or Ayin of the Magus, is manifest on every level and represents the expansion of Malkuth, or creation, from Kether, the source. This is the hollow pillar which extends from the unmanifest and loops back around like the Ouroboros. Thus, the actions are self-fulfilled in their act and in the will that they work out, self-fulfilled in their being in the universal eternity, the fractal of manifestation, that is, the palace of God, the soul within. And so, this whole concept of the pentagram, the soul within, and this the radiant of the solar principle, the spirit, the fifth element, essentially. It's ironic that 73 times 5 is 365, the the terrestrial year, and 72 times 5 is the circle, the pentagram. 73 I saw in my mind as like the point in the circle, but then again expanded. I don't know how exactly to term this, but also the fact that 365 is 301, or the Hebrew Aleph Shin, which is Ash, or fire. fire, which in 301 is also Selene in Greek. So the moon and the earth make essentially the sun. 365. There's so many ways of looking at this, though, and even on my like YouTube channel front piece, whatever it's called, the dragon in Hebrew, Drakun, the dragon is 365 plus fire again. So the fire dragon is 666. Essentially the Kundalini, again, the solar spiritual force that enlivens or activates Malkuth. But so again, I'm just trying to show how universal and really positive 666 is, even though it's considered this like evil, ignorant, like it's a number of samsara essentially. But samsara is basically the like a certain aspect of nirvana, heaven upside down in a sense, or just the labyrinth of the soul itself. So I don't know, it's just weird. I went to the bookstore, and I haven't went in a while. I don't really go anymore. And I was like, oh, I'm just going to try to let it speak to me. Like, whatever I find that's worth anything, if anything, like if I find something worth getting, I was using it as a sort of experiment. And the only book I found, like I didn't even know of it, but then I found it and I looked into it and I was like, whoa, this is really worth $10 is all I paid for it, but it's really worth way more than that. And it's De Anima, with the commentary by St. Thomas Aquinas, but Aristotle's De Anima. And it's all about the soul and how essentially, I don't know, it was weird timing, because this whole thing about the fifth element and its elusiveness, but yet how it's really the animating or activating principle of the elements and materiality, and this funny paradox of spirit and matter in time. But I come to find De Anima is perfectly 111, like, and that just clicked for me in so many ways, because again, it's Aleph, or really air in Greek, or Rho is 100, so the air of Aleph, and Malkuth, and the white light crystallizing essentially in the prism, and the paradox in Hebrew of dazzling brilliance and also thick darkness, essentially the beginning and the end in the whole fool's journey. I don't know, just this 73, reading the urn, and then a very close friend of mine passing away on April 2nd, the 10th year of since I got that egg, and subsequently learned so much of this stuff. It affected me pretty well, like powerfully, and I saw everything that had happened in the like 2 years I knew this person, and I really considered, like, in a sense, their message in my life as being similar to essentially like the whole subject of the holy guardian angel kind of came into my mind, in the sense of this person showing me so many points of what life is really about, and putting everything into perspective in a very Chokmah sense, and then realizing again, not only is Chokmah 73, but then Ha-Chokmah, Ha being the, again, Hey, 78, and Ha-Chokmah, the wisdom, as 78, also being Mesla, destiny, or the influence from Kether, and essentially fortune or fate. And I don't know, just that aspect of, I guess, the goddess, if you want to call it that, where the opposites are more easily reconciled, I guess. In what comes to mind for me is just Malkuth Sheba, or the Queen of Sheba, 793, in this womb, essentially, of creation, or whatever you want to call it. 73 Gimel, again, it's like a weird umbilical cord. An umbilicus to Chokmah is like the umbilical cord between the soul and Kether, or God, it seems like. And that those two ends of that link, that chalazi or whatever, that link in the egg, makes me think of this relationship between Chokmah and the pentagram and Earth, essentially. And so I've had a lot of other thoughts like written down on this whole thing. It's a very complex, it's complex, but it's kind of obvious. Chayim, like from Otz Chayim, the Tree of Life, Chayim, Ha Chayim actually is 73, the life or living, the life force. So again, it's that living expression, and it's 73 is 593 less than 666, and 593 is the 108th prime number, and has so many connections to, like, I would say Hinduism collectively, but Eastern thought, because it's Purusha, it's the whole Samkhya Karika, Samkhya itself, the Samkhya philosophy has really helped so much. Like, I originally wanted to read and learn about that just because I knew Samkhya is 137, and it seems to be a parallel to the Kabbalah. But then, after reading the Samkhya Karika and letting so many of its things like soak in and whatnot, I see how limited that perspective of wanting to like fit it in this little Kabbalistic framework, how limited that is to the true value and essence of the Samkhya as a sort of like a system, essentially, of the tattvas and the understanding of the framework or the fabric, the lattice work of the dynamics involved with all that. And again, how this interlaces with what we call time, the year, and space-time, essentially. Space-time, spirit, and matter. And I don't know. So I knew, like, I kept seeing these references to Paris working in Liber 73, but I'd also heard of it, like, I've known of it, but I kept thinking about it in relation to this sort of Tracy Twyman aspect of things, of looking into this sort of other darker side of not just Crowley's work, but the interest in Crowley's work. And there was even more, like in Liber 40 or 415, showing an inkling or like a little hint of this sort of, which Crowley even says that there was, that Richter Neuburg was receiving impressions of a sort of demonic character at some point in the working. And it just seems like that whole side of things, I don't know, it's very what certain people, I guess, in like Hollywood, or maybe not Hollywood, etc., or maybe not Hollywood per se, but just certain, because I mean it's in Britain as well, historically certain people in various areas, but Britain and the US have kind of inverted this sort of stuff and used it negatively, which it's hard to say. Like Crowley himself with the whole cross of the frog or the crucifixion of that toad, I mean, and then again in Liber 415 the references to ritual murder, essentially, they don't do any favors. But at the same time, like they say in Liber 415, it is the traditional method of essentially if not gaining favor, but like gaining, essentially there was Jupiterian workings, and I don't know, sacrifice, blood, blah blah blah. Elementally, at least, it's supposed to be like the whole theology or the theory behind it is that it's releasing, and like not just releasing, but a sort of mechanical function behind sacrifice, at least in terms of the elemental energy and whatnot. And in my experience is like, I don't know, I mean, I don't have a whole lot of experience in terms of ritual working, but apparently there can be substitutions there, but at the same time, like apparently in Liber 415, Jupiter or whatever the force they were working with wasn't keeping, like, because they weren't keeping up with the sacrifices, it wasn't really fueling them. And so I don't know, like, that's that's probably the most controversial aspect of ceremonial practice, I guess. But, and I don't know, I don't condone it, but I also see I understand the theoretical value behind it, but again, I would say maybe someone should consider why, like, things in the longer scheme of things and whether that's even worth it or necessary, I guess. But the whole samsara thing, the fifth element, the releasing of the fifth element, has been essentially one of the points, I guess, I've gained from this, is that the toroidal nature of space-time, spirit and matter, and de anima, essentially, which again, 111 minus 73. I know that 74 and 37 are 111, and that's essentially the heart and blood, because it's halab and ladam, the heart and blood. But 37 is also chitta, and there's other ways of looking at this, and I've been contemplating it, but whether you consider it in the Hebrew form or various whatever Eastern forms like Sanskrit or even Tibetan, there's a lot of, it's a similar way of looking at it, essentially, is that there's this quantum glue that literally does, it's like it really is the one substance of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, and that one substance has numerous permutations, essentially elements, but it's really the one substance, the unconditioned clear light, which again, I wanted to make a point of this, the unconditioned, which is one of those terms in Samkhya and then also Buddhism that comes up a lot, the unconditioned absolute, or just the unconditioned element, which is the spiritual element. So the unconditioned, and then clear light. The unconditioned clear light, which is the heart and crown of Buddha. So the heart and crown, or the crown heart, the heart crown, like, I don't know how else you could put it, because there's essentially, it's just the and symbol, or the addition of heart and crown, which I found that, like, I forgot how, but again, how these ideas come together in such a number like 666, which has so much data accumulated and compiled in it, if but you had the keys from which to see. And it's like, well, what is that? What value? How can I make money off of that? It's like, I don't know. It's not about making money. It's about seeing, again, like I had this revelation about, I guess, after reading Liber 415 and realizing 107, again, as, I forgot what I saw it as, but I was like, whoa, now I really understand this whole concept of 107 as gold, but also essentially ulam, or consciousness. And it is a Jupiterian formula or principle, especially relating to the final hay. Essentially, all these concepts are like also not just in 666, but 107, and that being gold and the solar radiance or splendor. The whole thing about Midas touch and everything everything he touches turning to gold is a funny myth or whatever, legend, story. Just in this realm, or subject or whatever, and the whole question of like, well, what is valuable when everything is gold? And essentially it's just the timing and energy and placement, the feng shui, the Tao, essentially, of the Tao of things. And I don't know, in a way that's what, to me, 73 is so much of like this Madhyamaka. I said Samkhya, but it's also a Madhyamaka number because it's so much of this like middle way wisdom. The whole thing about Chokmah being the extension of Kether, and why Crowley associated it so heavily with Mercury, and what he says about Mercury in Liber 415. I don't know, it's just weird how tightly succinct all this stuff is, and I don't expect that like to make much sense at all to anyone who hasn't, like, I guess, had the same or similar path of going down, but it's weird how much this all comes together. For example, even 415, it's also 83 times 5, but 415 plus 365 is 780, which is also pentagram, and 780 is A and the I. Again, there's the 78. It's also 156, or Babylon times 5, which I just read 161, which is 156 plus 5, so it's like Ha Babylon, or really it's also the Zion, or Zion, the link between Babylon and Zion, which is also the heavenly man, the body of the heavenly man being Babylon, the city. So yeah, 780, Indra's net. 780 plus the 301 is also 181, or 1081, or Tifereth. So the flaming eye, I guess. I don't know. So much. Again, it's just the way my brain works at this point, trying to consider all these different things, which I guess to some people would be schizophrenic. Oh, you're just schizophrenic. Oh well. Chapter 7 of The Ancient Secret in Search of the Holy Grail by Flavia Anderson. Descent into Hades. Hades is as much a real place as the Grail and sword are real objects. To study the ritual of the underworld, it is necessary to understand the conflicting emotions in man, and also the struggle between a primitive and a more advanced civilization. The ceremony of lighting a fire from the sun is essentially beautiful, calling up in the imagination the finest ideas of the beneficence and condescension of God. If the ritual of Hades is repellent, it should be realized that to call down either the flame or the sun or the Holy Spirit from heaven is to call down power, and power can be used either for good or evil. It is the old story of the fall of Lucifer, the light bearer. In very early paintings, the head of Satan is adorned with a glory of light, similar to that which illuminates the head of our Lord and the saints, showing that in ancient times this was well understood. In the temptation of Christ by the devil, the scriptures show us that Christ could have used his power for evil had he so chosen. The study of Hades, therefore, is the study of the abuse of power. Furthermore, as we are going to explore the Celtic Hades, it should be realized that the more mystically inclined and by nature temperamentally devotional a race is, the more it will be in danger of going to extremes, of perpetrating horrors in the name of God. Thus, the Greeks and Romans, who were not in the main a race of mystics, very early found excuses for ransoming a devoted victim, whereas the Spaniards of the Inquisition, in whose veins ran the blood of Celts and Moors, committed ghastly atrocities, often with the purest of motives. The Celt, in his own way, was as zealous a seeker after God as the Jew, but unlike Abraham, he had not yet, at the time we are speaking of, heard the word of God wherein the command was given to substitute the ram for the human sacrifice. With the spread of culture from Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC, two different rituals came into conflict. A good example of this is to be found in Ireland. The Firbolgs were the primitive men who worshipped the giant forces of nature, the Fomorians. The Firbolgs lit fire from their flint bags. To them, the flame was a living creature which must be fed with fuel and with a share of their meat, and even on occasions with human flesh. To their shores came the Milesians, bringing Pharaoh's daughter in the cauldron of their god Dagda. Fire ceased to be the weird red animal and became instead the emanation of the all-pervading sky god. But, unfortunately, a new revelation of truth can never at once win free from the old faith. For centuries it remains cluttered up with the more primitive ritual, as is shown so clearly by the apocryphal and largely pagan legends with which Christianity was burdened until long after medieval times. The entombment of the Grail was not itself a bad symbolism, and was practiced by the Egyptians, as will presently be shown. It merely symbolized the need of all material things for regeneration. But the sacrifices which accompanied the entombment originated in the older cult, which was at conflict with the new. It seems a pity that all the books so far written on Druidism are so strictly pigeonholed into two classes. The first, much favored in the early 19th century, is based on the beauty and mysticism of Welsh bardic verse, in the belief that all men shared something of the original and pure faith of Noah. Such authors jump wildly to conclusions, and amongst their various errors, they fail to realize the very late date at which Gallic or Belgic Druids were officiating, compared with far earlier cultures of which archaeologists now have knowledge. The second and more modern school of thought is a natural reaction from the first. Annoyed by the imaginative flights of the last century, the latest authors see in the Druids no more than the witch doctors of Gaul, who practiced human sacrifice, and whose belief in an afterworld was nothing but a primitive totemism. The truth surely lies between the two opinions, insomuch as man has never been without an apprehension of God, but has often fallen into error as to how best to serve him. Several books have been written within the last 20 years in an attempt to throw light on whether Caesar's statements regarding the Druids were correct, namely that the Druid priesthood was peculiar to Gaul and Britain, that Britain was the source of Druidism and the center of their initiations, and that the German tribes had no Druids but worshipped the sun, the moon, and fire. That Britain probably was the principal center of initiation, because of Hades being situated therein, I shall presently endeavor to show. As to the rest, it seems to me a superfluous question, for there was no place in Europe where men did not at one time or another practice the cult of fire descending through the Grail, and the name by which the priests were known at a particular period, and in a particular country, is of little importance in a study of the mysteries. It is supposed that those of Britain and Gaul took their name of Druids from Dru, meaning an oak tree, because in the territories over which they held sway, the oak provided acorn flour and fire. It was their brand stock. In other countries, the palm or the pine may have given its name to the priesthood, but the ritual of the fire cult remained the same. What then do we know for certain regarding the Druids of the 1st and 2nd centuries in Gaul and Britain? They were sufficiently cultured to speak and write Greek, and classical references credit them with a firm belief in an afterlife of a much happier and more definite kind than the miserable existence of the shades in Pluto's kingdom. Welsh poetry, admittedly of a medieval period, frequently alludes to the fact that the Druids exhorted the people to be virtuous, courageous, and avoid unjust or dishonorable dealing. Practically all the classical references assert that the Druids were Pythagoreans, and that they believed in some form of reincarnation. Modern authors have attempted to belittle this claim by arguing that no references to it are to be found in Celtic myth, other than the totemistic reincarnations of a man into a tree or beast. It seems to me unwise to assume that the educated writers of Greece and Rome, who knew the beliefs of Pythagoras, and who had first-hand opportunity of speaking with the Druids, would have identified the two beliefs without very good grounds. Be that as it may, the Druids certainly had a much more cheerful outlook towards death than their Roman neighbors. For Lucan writes, "And ye Druids, now that the sword is removed, begin once more your barbaric rites and weird solemnities. To you only is given knowledge, or ignorance, whichever it be, of the gods and power of heaven. Your dwelling is in the lair of the forest. From you we learn that the bourne of man's ghost is not the senseless grave, nor the pale realm of the monarch below. In another world his spirit survives still. Death, if your lore be true, is but the passage to enduring life." Those who wish to read all the classical references to Druids, and then to draw their own conclusions, will find Mr. T.D. Kendrick's book, The Druids, excellent for this purpose. Alternatively, those who wish to study Druidism as shown by the late Welsh bards may find The Mythology and Rites of the British Druids by Edward Davies helpful. For though his attempts to relate all ritual to Noah have suffered discredit, yet he gives a very good picture of what ritual was actually practiced. Coupled with this firm faith in the next world, the classical writers refer often to the barbaric rites of the Gallic priesthood. The Druids, Caesar tells us, believed that only human blood could blot out the sin of man, in Gallic War, Book 6, Chapter 16. They read auguries from the entrails of their human victims, and sometimes burned them alive in wicker cages. Nevertheless, by AD 50, and probably owing to Roman influence, human sacrifice had become, according to Pomponius Mela, merely a ritual bloodletting. There is hardly time here to discuss all the significance of the ritual of the scapegoat, but I take this opportunity to express my personal opinion that the desire to put sin upon the head of another argues that man has never been without a conscience and a sense of failure, a feeling of guilty so heavy as to demand the forfeiture of his life. Where he fell into error was in supposing that by borrowing blood from his neighbor, he could expiate his offense. For such borrowing only increases the guilt, and like a loan from a moneylender, the interest on the original sum grows at such an alarming rate as to become impossible of payment by humankind. The history of the ritual of the scapegoat should not, therefore, in my view, be used as an argument against the beauty and potency of our Lord's sacrifice upon the cross. For it needed God and man to make a full, perfect, and sufficient oblation in blood for the debt which mankind had been laying up for untold centuries, by the ghastly practice of human sacrifice, apart from all other sins. From the time of the coming of Egyptian culture to Europe, it is very unlikely that the barbarian tribes indulged in cannibalism, but it is possible, though not proved, that the early flint-bag men did. Having said a word about the scapegoat, it might be as well, therefore, to follow it up with a brief paragraph on this subject. In the study of comparative religions, it is becoming more common amongst certain schools of thought to connect such abuses with the institution of the Christian sacraments, to the detriment of the latter. A few months ago I listened with some impatience to a public discussion on the cult of the Great Mother Goddess and her dying son. When the speakers had reached a skillful peroration wherein cannibalism and a Eucharistic feast were associated, they seemed to indicate that the last word had been said. In fact, they had failed utterly to touch on the question of what cannibalism is, and what emotions it can arouse in man. It was always ritualistic, and never indulged in from appetite. It was no more than an innocent desire on the part of primitive man to take into himself the qualities which he knew he lacked. The great wisdom, courage, and fair-mindedness, the prowess in battle, or the skill in medicine which distinguished the chief of the tribe, were qualities which his less heroic brethren longed to possess. It was a man's sense of something lacking in himself, and of a separation from the fountain of all being, which was the motive behind such practice, and the emotion is a good one, only wrong in that man's ignorance led him to suppose that by eating his chief, he could eat the chief's qualities. As an instance of what I mean, let the reader walk up to the hilltops in springtime and gaze at a really beautiful sunset. In 9 cases out of 10, his mouth will open, and a sigh issuing from the lips will bear witness that he has first taken a deep breath in his spontaneous and natural reaction of trying to take all that inexpressible beauty into himself, and to become one with it. Insomuch as he opened his mouth and breathed deeply, he is a cannibal, for he has shown his desire to absorb and engulf God and beauty, but I do not suppose that this thought will greatly disturb him. Let us now examine what characteristics are required in an underground cave for it to be used in religious ritual as the entrance to the kingdom of the shades. First, its depths must proceed into the bowels of the earth farther than a man can follow them. For, if at least he comes up against a rock face, his imagination can no longer be terrified by what might lie beyond. Then, if possible, the cave must be able to give out noises. The more awful, the more will the place be identified with the abode of ghosts. Now, the only caves which can supply these characteristics easily are those formed by subterranean rivers. There is a point where the rocky roof meets the water, beyond which a man cannot wade without the certainty of drowning. Furthermore, the air pressure caught in these channels by the varying level of the flood, will escape at intervals with a clap whose echoes reverberate in the caverns. Lucan describes such a place and locales it at Marseilles, but it is more than probable that he is confusing the Druid grove there with the British Hades. A grove there was, untouched by men's hands from ancient times, whose interlacing boughs enclosed a space of darkness and cold shade, and banished the sunlight far above. No rural Pan dwelt there, no Sylvanus, ruler of the woods, no nymphs, but gods were worshipped there with savage rites. The altars were heaped with hideous offerings, and every tree was sprinkled with human gore. On those boughs, if antiquity reverential of the gods deserves any credit, birds feared to perch. In those coverts wild beasts would not lie down. No wind ever bore down upon that wood, nor thunderbolt hurled from black clouds. The trees, even when they spread their leaves to no breeze, rustled of themselves. Water also fell there in abundance from dark springs. The images of the gods, grim and rude, were uncouth blocks formed of felled tree trunks. Their mere antiquity and the ghastly hue of their rotten timber struck terror. Men fell less awe of deities worshipped under familiar forms, so much does it increase their sense of fear not to know the gods whom they dread. Legend also told that often the subterranean hollows quaked and bellowed, that yew trees fell down and rose again, and that the glare of conflagration came from trees that were not on fire, and that serpents twined and glided round the stems. The people never resorted thither to worship at close quarters, but left the place to the gods. For when the sun is in mid-heaven or dark night fills the sky, the priest himself dreads their approach, and fears to surprise the lord of the grove. Lucan, Civil War, Book 3, 399. I have given the quotation in full to show what terrors were conjured up by such a place. Lucan was only writing from hearsay, and might easily have confused the Druids' account of their grove at Marseilles and their initiatory cave in Britain. The reference to the tree which appeared to burn without being consumed, and the serpents wound round it, should be noted. Not having had the opportunity of examining the caves of the Mediterranean world, I should very much like to have the opportunity of examining the caves of Crete, in particular the Idaean cave, where legend has it that Zeus was reared, and where plano-convex lenses of rock crystal have been found. See A.B. Cook, Zeus, Volume 2, Appendix B, page 935. I admit to the temptation of considering the British Hades to be the prototype of all such initiatory grottos, because of its surprising similarity to the accounts of Hades in all the legends of the world. Indeed, it is not impossible that traders from the Mediterranean brought back word that of all the known mouths of the abyss, the one in the British garden of the Hesperides was the most awful. These caverns are situated within a few miles of Glastonbury Tor, and are formed by the river Axe as it winds its subterranean way out of the Mendip Hills. Its old name, Ochi Hole, now called Wookie, is supposed to come from an old British word ogo, meaning a hole. Mr. H.E. Balch, F.S.A., has spent his life excavating and examining the caves of the Mendips, and his book Mendip, The Great Cave of Wookie Hole, published by Simpkin, Marshall Limited, should be read by every student of the Grail legend. The cave is approached from a semi-oval cove, a wooded gully in the side of the hill, which would have been thickly forested in ancient times. Out of the rock face flows the river Axe, and a little above to the side of the arch of its exit is the entrance to an earlier river bed. In the entrance gallery of this old bed, Mr. Balch has found traces of occupation by men of Pleistocene times. From here, a very steep, sloping, and narrow passage, known as the Hell Ladder, leads down into the bowels of the earth. You come then into the first great chamber, filled with little pools and stalactites, which gleam like crystal or ice in the glow of what is now electric, but of old would have been torchlight. In a central and resting position in this large cavern is an almost jet-black stalagmite, peculiarly horrible in its resemblance to, or caricature of, a sphinx. For nature has poured out the features and breasts in lopsided misshapen surges of dripping limestone, so that at one moment the resemblance to a hideous female face and breasts, and at another is mercifully hidden. This natural image has been known since time immemorial as the Witch of Wookie. Mr. Balch is of the opinion that it received divine honors in ancient times. To my mind, there is little doubt that it is the image of dread Persephone. Beside her crouches the little stalagmite known as her dog, and here Cerberus received offerings of bones, which Mr. Balch has found. At the feet of the witch, steps have been cut down to the river, and here in the water Mr. Balch found the skulls which were probably overlooked by the Christian exorcists when they came to give the place its spiritual cleansing. In the left breast of the goddess, whose name in Grail legend was Brandigan, a socket has been hollowed, and the decomposed remains of the wood which had been thrust into it were discovered. This, then, if I am right, was how the Celtic Vesta, or Ceres, held her torch fastened in her bosom, and her cave, as we shall see, is none other than the Chapel Perilous. Round her have been found coins and pottery dating from 100 BC to the 4th century of our era. From the most ancient times there has existed a local legend of a wicked woman who lived in this cave, and who was changed into stone. Mallory gives his account of the transformation in this fashion. He calls the Grail the scabbard of Excalibur, an understandable confusion when it is remembered that a sword drawn from a scabbard, and the fiery brand is drawn from the Grail. Then King Arthur looked upon the sword and liked it passing well. Whether liketh you better, said Merlin, the sword or the scabbard? Me liketh better the sword, said King Arthur. Ye are more unwise, said Merlin, for the scabbard is worth 10 of the sword. But the day comes when the Grail is taken back by the queen of the underworld. When the king awoke and missed his scabbard, he was wondrous wroth, and asked who had been there. And they said his sister Queen Morgan had been there, and had put the scabbard under her mantle, and was gone. Arthur pursued her, and when he saw she might not escape, she rode unto a lake thereby, and said, Whatsoever becometh of me, my brother shall not have this scabbard. And then she let throw the scabbard in the deepest of the water, and it sunk, for it was so heavy of gold and precious stones. Then she rode into a valley where many great stones were, and when she saw that she must needs be overtaken, she shop herself, horse and man, by enchantment, into a great marble stone. It will be seen here that Arthur was credited with taking part in a pagan ritual, but I do not believe this to have been the case. That he was a Christian will be shown more fully later, but the following account gives some evidence of his struggling to abolish the remnants of the heathen cult. In the story of Colwick and Olwen from the Mabinogion, Colwick is daunted by the task put upon him of obtaining the blood of the Black Witch, the daughter of the White Witch, who lived in a cave at the headwaters of the Stream of Sorrow, on the confines of hell. Arthur undertakes the task and hacks the witch in two. Mr. Balch found what is probably the skeleton of this wretched creature in the entrance of the cave, with the right femur buried under debris 20 feet away. Beside her were the bones of tethered goats, her milking pot, her sacrificial knife, and most curious of all, the traditional witch's ball, which had been fashioned by primitive tools from a lump of stalagmite. Thus there are two legends which have become confused, the one of the goddess and the other of her worshipper. The remains of the latter bear mute witness to the nemesis which overtakes those who will not accept a new and more spiritual revelation, but cling to their outworn ritual, even though they must resort to fashioning a useless grail out of grey limestone. For by Arthur's day, all that was good in the old religion, including the crystal sphere itself, had been transferred to the church, and all that remained was the black bread of evil magic, which the good phoenix strikes mercilessly from the hand of mankind. This headwater of the Stream of Sorrow is referred to in Grail legend as Mount Dolorous. From the first great chamber of Brandigan, one proceeds into a cavern 75 feet high. This has always been known as the Hall, and if I am right, it is none other than the Hall of the Fisher King, jeweled with gleaming stalactites and stalagmites. Beyond it lies the third chamber, a low, wide cavern always known as the Witch's Parlor, whose sandy shore borders the subterranean river. The axe flows into the parlor from a low arch, and here we begin to understand the necessity of crossing the Styx in the ferryman's boat. For if we are able to enter that low arch and penetrate into the inner chamber, we must either paddle a small boat, or wait until the flood levels have subsided sufficiently to show the old stepping stones. On the other hand, if flood level is too high, our boat will be crushed against the roof of the arched tunnel, and we shall be swept away and drowned in some ghastly black channel beyond the reach of help. Nevertheless, men did enter here, and this inner chamber has borne from ancient times the name of the Holy Hole. I believe it to have been the winter shrine of the Grail. It will be seen now why the drawbridge of the Grail castle disappears from time to time, and why so often the Grail hero is either fetched by the Fisher King's boat, or half drowned by the demon water horse which he has mounted. At the present time there is no landing place in the Holy Hole, but Mr. Balch thinks that there may have been dry channels beyond in the days before modern drainage of land increased the level of the river. No one now can follow the course of the river beyond this inner chamber without diving apparatus, and the attempts at diving have proved the chapel perilous, worthy of its name. We come now to Mr. Balch's description of the noises that bubbles of air can cause in these awful subterranean hollows. The fame of this phenomenon had certainly spread abroad in the 3rd century, for Clement of Alexandria wrote thus: "Those who have composed histories say that in Britain is a certain cave at the side of a mountain, and at the entrance a gap. When, then, the wind blows into the cave and is drawn onto the bosom of the interior, a sound is heard as the clashing of numerous cymbals. The same sounds of these clashing cymbals are heard to this day in Wookey, also hammering noises, as though the dwarves of Niflheim were forging Sigurd's ring. Once Mr. Balch heard such strange gurglings, as of a man struggling and shouting in the water, that he rushed to the bank below the witch's image, fearful that some visitor had been sucked beneath the arch of the river, but there was no one. On the roof of the parlor the hoofs of a galloping horse have been heard, though the distance to the hilltop above precludes all possibility of its being a natural beast. This is important, for the water horse of the Grail hero plays an important part in the legend. Lastly, Mr. Balch gives an account of what he alone of all men living has heard, for his companion was later killed in the Great War of 1914. The two were standing together in the hall when the sound as of a confused murmur of voices came to them. Believing the voices to come from a party of tourists, they waited with the kindly intention of adding to the interest of the visitors by describing the excavations at first hand. The murmur grew to a clamor, then a roar, and then such a thunderous noise enveloped them that they were left clinging like little children together. The sudden silence was painful, and no disturbances of water or air ensued to explain the strange occurrence. It is hardly to be wondered at that Persephone fainted in the Chapel Perilous. That at certain festivals the sacra of the Greek mysteries were hidden underground is well known. See Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion by Jane Harrison. But I think I may be the first to suggest that one particular symbol was common and invariably entombed by all the peoples of Europe and the Near East, namely the vessel or cauldron by which fire was kindled from the sun. Hesiod's Theogony is the earliest account of the Greek gods, and in it we find that a golden vessel is periodically brought out of Hades, filled with water from the Styx, as a sacred symbol on which the gods take irrevocable oaths. First, he described a terrible female monster in Hades, so like our sphinx-like stalagmite that again one is forced to wonder from what source the legend of both sphinx and monster originated. She is no ways like to mortal men or immortal gods, he says, but dwells in a hollow cavern. The divine, stubborn-hearted Echidna, half nymph with dark eyes and fair cheeks, and half, on the other hand, a serpent, huge and terrible and vast, speckled and flesh-devouring, neath the caves of sacred earth. Hesiod's Theogony, Bond's Classical Library, page 17. Then, in another passage, he goes on to describe Hades. There in front stand the resounding mansions of the infernal god, of mighty Hades and awful Persephone besides, and a fierce dog keeps guard in front. The dog probably symbolized the parching dog star, Sothis or Sirius, which heralded the Nile floods and the demise of the divine youth. The same dog which the Grail hero always takes with him to hunt the head of the stag. The 3 heads of Cerberus may have derived their origin from the particular shape of some stalagmite. Hesiod goes on, there too dwells a goddess, odious to immortals, dread Styx, eldest daughter of backflowing ocean, and apart from the gods she inhabits renowned dwellings vaulted by huge rocks, and round about on all sides they are strengthened to heaven by silver columns. A description, no doubt, of stalactites, and seldom goes the fleet-footed daughter of Thomas, Iris, on a message over the broad back of the sea, namely, when haply strife and quarrel shall have arisen among the immortals, and whosoever I wot of them that hold Olympian dwellings utters falsehood, then also Jove is wont to send Iris to bring from far in the golden ewer the great oath of the gods, the renowned water cold as it is, which also runs down from a steep and lofty rock. Whosoever of immortals that occupy the top of snowy Olympus shall have offered this as a libation, and sworn over it a false oath, lies breathless until the completion of a year, nor ever comes near the repast of nectar and ambrosia, but also lies breathless and speechless on a strewn couch, and a baneful stupor overshrouds him. Hesiod's Theogony, Bond's Classical Library, page 28. Here we have a picture of the defunct son of the sun, lying upon the bier, which always accompanies the Grail while the new hero succeeds the office. Apuleius in the Golden Ass tells how the cruel mother Venus made Psyche descend into Hades to fetch water from the Styx in a jar of polished crystal. We know that the pearl-rimmed cauldron of the Celts was associated with Hades, and we come now to the metrical preface to Chrétien's Conte du Graal, which I omitted in Chapter 1 for fuller study here. Whoever wrote it, and it may not have been Chrétien, explains that the whole purport of Arthur's gathering together the Knights of the Round Table was to reinstitute the custom whereby a maiden issued from a grotto with a golden cup. That this is probably a gross slander of a Christian king need not concern us here. Rightly or wrongly, legend identified Arthur with the solar cult, and our task is to study the cult with which legend credited him. The poet explains the custom as follows. These maidens dwelt in caves, which the old tales elsewhere calls grottos, hewn out by more than mortal art in the depths of the forest. They were accustomed to issue forth with a golden cup, and with food and drink for the wayfarer. For then, I trow, there came out of the grotto a maiden they could not have wished for one more fair. In her hand she bore a golden chalice. But once, long ago, a wicked king ravished one of these maidens and took her cup away. Since then they had never more issued from their caverns. The peers of the Round Table, when they heard the tale related, were at once filled with a desire to win back the grottos, and they prayed God that he might recover the grottos and restore them to those hands which formerly possessed them. I will give now the ritual for disentombing this symbol of spring, and we will see whether the various legends support my supposition. As at the grove of Nemi, the man appointed to be priest-king first fights with and slays his predecessor, and, using a real sword, he decapitates him. The Druids have already extinguished all fires except the one torch, the special brand of the late king, which the stalagmite Brandigan holds in her breast. The new hero lays the head of his predecessor at Brandigan's feet, and the late king's torch is then extinguished, either by the hero or the druid. The hero must then penetrate to the hall of the Fisher King, and inquire concerning the use and symbolic meaning of the Grail. Having acquired this knowledge, he must then penetrate to the inner chamber or holy hole, and his journey will not be made easy, for it is a test of his courage. Having gained the inner chamber, he must unveil the Grail and take possession of it, and then at last bear it forth revealed in procession up the Tor for the rekindling of a new fire. The local traditions speak of this yearly battle between Gwyn ap Nudd and Gwythyr for the possession of a maiden. This might, of course, mean no more than the celestial battle between Gwyn, who was lord of the underworld, and Gwythyr, a hero whose name may derive from Gwydir, a variant of vitrine or glass. The fight might only refer to the glass holder's struggle to penetrate the obscurities of the underworld. In the preface to Grand Saint Grail, the monk is bidden to seek his lost book of the Grail by first going to a great stone in the plains of a place called Walaskog, or Waleskog. which the poet wrongly supposes to be in Norway, for it is obviously the Ogo of Wales, Wookiee, though in AD 700 it may well have been held by Norse settlers, and the story of Beowulf suggests that it was. The monk will recognize Wælskog, he is told, by the Fountain of Tears in the Vale of the Dead, where the famous battle between the two best knights of the world took place. And there he will find a strange beast, part sheep, part dog, part wolf, yet another allusion to the chimerical stalagmite. It would be pleasant to suppose that the battle took place between the forces of light and darkness only, but there is, I fear, too much evidence to the contrary. The tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, who lives near the Wirral, a small hill beside Glastonbury Tor, is a story in point. The Green Knight lays his neck to Gawain's sword, in return for Gawain's promise to undergo a similar fate in a year's time. Lancelot in the Conte du Grail makes the same bargain, and so does Carados Briz Bras, and while Perceval's sister calls the brand the sword with the strange girdle, she nevertheless gives it a second name, the memory of blood, and she explains that of the 3 spindles on the stem of the Grail tree, Solomon's bed, the third is red in memory of Abel's murder by Cain. Furthermore, there are all too frequent references by the Christian poets that Arthur's knights were sent out to end certain evil customs. In Y. Saint Grail, a hermit tells Galahad, "And God came to this world to free mankind from the evil belief and wearisome adventures that were on them." So we may understand through similitude that Jesus Christ is sent thee also, being his knight to cast out the evil adventures and customs that were in the kingdom of England. This is only one typical example amongst many references to evil customs. The fight of Beowulf and Grendel almost certainly records the coming of a Dane from Mercia to the West Danes, who had settled upon the shores of the Bristol Channel, and of his very real fight in a subterranean cave. Grendel, who was perhaps a priest, demands human sacrifice, but cannot touch the throne, for by that time the ritual protected the king's life. Beowulf kills Grendel, but the Witch of Wookiee is not satisfied and demands further blood. So Beowulf braves the terrors of the cavern below the mere. Over it hang rimy groves, and a wood which with clenched roots overshrouds the water. There may every night a fearful portent be seen, fire on the flood. None so wiseth liveth of the children of men as to know the depth. He enters the bowels of earth, and then did the Earl perceive that he was in some strange abysmal hall, where no water at all molested him. Nor could the violence of the flood touch him, being kept off by the roofed hall. Firelight he saw, and eerie lustre shining bright. Then the hero knew it was the she-wolf of the abyss, the mighty carline of the mere. Onset he delivered with slaughter bill. His hand delayed not the stroke, so that about her head the costly blade resounded a greedy war song. Then did the visitor discover that the battle gleamer would not bite, not scathe life, but the edge failed the master at need. As has been explained, the brand always fails in the hour of need, for it is the torch which is extinguished by the master's life. But Beowulf avoids the sacrificial knife of Brandigan's priesthood, for, just as it was about to be plunged into his heart, then he saw among the armor a monumental cutlass, an old Eotinish sword of edge effective, a trophy of warriors. He draws this jeweled arm and slays the witch. The glimmer flashed up, light filled the place, even as from heaven serenely shineth the candle of the firmament. The hilt of the jeweled trophy is the Grail, which gives light, and when Beowulf reissues from the cave, the brand melts away like ice, leaving only the hilt in his hands. Yet another example of how the hilt of the magic sword is thought of as separate from the blade. He carries this hilt, the Grail, to the king, and presents it to him as a gift. Then was the gilded hilt given to the veteran soldier, the hoary leader in battle given into his hand, ancient workmanship of the giants. It passed, after the demons were quelled, into the possession of the prince of the Danes, a work of mystic smiths. Hrothgar, the king, then surveys the trophy. He surveyed the hilt, the old relic. Upon it was written the origin of the primeval quarrel, what time the flood, the rushing ocean, destroyed the giants' brood. That was a tribe estranged from the eternal captain. To them did the ruler assign final retribution with whelming water. Likewise, on the mounting of sheer gold, there was the rune staves rightly inscribed, set down and said, for whom that sword has erst been wrought, best of steely fabrics, with wreathen hilt and dragon ornament. Deeds of Beowulf, translated by John Earle, pages 44 and 49. It is extremely interesting to find that here the Grail is associated with antediluvian times, and that it is decorated with the usual serpent. The quenching of Brandigan's torch signified assumption of divine and royal honors with possession of the Grail, and a new fire, but, alas, brought its consequence of the slayer eventually being slain. The following account from the prose Percival shows how gradually there was instituted a custom of substituting a less valuable member of the tribe for the king who had proved to be a wise leader. The reader should imagine a palisade of megalithic stones, hung with painted hides, in place of the palace, in tapestries provided by the medieval poet, and the city which is all aflame, and whose flame Lancelot has power to extinguish, if only he will accept the crown. If not, of course, a burning city, but a sacred fire within a city, whose king must always perish at the end of the year. Up at the casements of the great mansions, noble ladies and damsels give utterance to their joy and thankfulness, saying to one another, "See, they are bringing the new king. Now, the fire will die as the year draws to its close. But for the most part, ah, God, they say, what loss it is that so handsome a knight should perish thus. Nay, be silent, say the others, there will be much cause for comfort, since by his death this great city of ours will be saved, and from that day forward the whole kingdom will pray for his soul's repose." Lancelot found the great chamber draped and carpeted with precious silks, and the lords of the city arrayed ready to do him homage. This, however, he vehemently refused to accept, and set forth that he would never be their king or their lord on such terms. At this moment, behold a dwarf. The dwarf calls upon the lords of the city. "My lords, since this knight will not be a king, I am willing to reign in his stead." With that they set the crown on the dwarf's head, and Lancelot took his leave. The noble ladies and damsels averred that he had no wish to be king, only to die so soon. The following stories from the Poetic Edda of how the maiden Symbol was wooed and persuaded to issue from the terrible cavern to the upper world are a pleasant change in their beauty from the grim stories preceding. Both concern the spring goddess and her crystal necklace, the Brisinga men, though a Rimy cup is also mentioned. Frey was the sun god, and Freya was his sister wife, Earth, who owned the Brisinga men. Here she is called in turn Gerd, the earth, and Menglod, men meaning necklace. In the Lay of Skirnir, Frey looks down from his celestial abode and falls in love with Gerd. He desires her to come to him, and Skirnir is sent as his ambassador to bring her forth from the abode of the frost giant, another allusion to the ice-like stalactites. The characters speak in turn. Frey. In the courts of Gymir, the frost giant, saw I, that maiden most dear to me. Light shone out from her arms, and thence all the air and sea were ashine. Skirnir. Give me steed to bear me safe through the dim, enchanted flickering flame, and the sword which wages war of itself 'gainst the fearful Jotun folk. Frey. Here is steed to bear thee safe through the dim enchanted flickering flame, and the sword which wages war of itself, if he who bear it be bold. Skirnir arrives at the dreadful dwelling place of Gerd and finds that before the gate of the hall fierce dogs are chained. Then, with the offer of gifts, he attempts Gerd to follow him to Frey's meeting place. Skirnir: I come not of elves, nor of God's race am I, nor yet of the all-wise Vanir. Yet have I fared through the raging fire to visit the folk in your halls. 11 apples, all golden, have I. These will I give thee, Gerd, to win thy heart, that from henceforth Frey be deemed thy dearest life. Gerd refuses the apples, and Skirnir continues his pleading, offering her the ring Draupnir. Skirnir: Then a ring I offer thee. Once 'twas burned with Odin's youthful son. It lets fall ever 8 golden rings, of a like weight each 9th night. Gerd, however, refuses the ring, and Skirnir is reduced to threats. If she will not come with him, she shall be left forever imprisoned in the wintry home of the giants. Gerd relents. Gerd: Be gracious, rather, youth. Take now this rimy cup, filled with famous old mead. Little I thought that ever in life I should love a waneling well. Evidently the trysting place of the Grail and the sun is well known to the goddess, for Skirnir asks, When wilt thou, maiden, meet at the trysting the stalwart son of Njord? Gerd: Pine needle is the wood of peaceful faring. We twain know all the way. There shall Gerd bestow on the son of Njord her heart's love 9 nights hence. At the doom of the gods, when the world ends, Frey will be helpless to fight for the immortals, because having surrendered his sword to Skirnir, he will be weaponless. In the lay of Loki's mocking, the fire god taunts him with this: Wealth gravest thou, Frey, for Gymir's maid. Thou didst sell thy sword for Gerd. But how shalt thou fight when the sons of fire through the Mirkwood ride, poor wretch? In the last day-spring of Menglod, a youth has had put upon him the task of bringing Menglod forth from her halls as his bride. He goes first to consult his dead mother, Groa, probably Brandigan, and how to achieve this feat, and calling her spirit from the grave, he explains. Youth: A fearful task hath that false woman set me, who fondly my father hath clasped. She hath sent me where none may go, to seek the gay necklaced maiden Menglod. Groa advises him to proceed, and he arrives at the giant's home, whose gate is called Sounding Clanger, and the walls Guest Crusher. The youth asks, What monster is that? Who guards the threshold and prowls around the perilous flames? He is met by a priest or druid called Much Wise, and the following dialogue takes place. Youth: Now answer me, Much Wise, this that I ask, and fain would learn from thy lips. What is that tree which far and wide spreads limbs over every land? Much Wise: 'Tis the tree of Mimir, but no man knows by what roof it rises to heaven. 'Twill fall at last by what one least weens, for nor fire nor weapons will wound it. Youth: Now answer me, Much Wise, this that I ask, and fain would learn from thy lips. What befalls the fruit of that famous tree, which nor fire nor weapons will wound? Much Wise: The fruit thereof must be laid on the fire, for the weal of travailing women. They shall then come out who had been within. To mankind 'tis the giver of life. The tree is guarded by a wood snake, who can only be overcome by the mistletoe which slew Balder. Much Wise: 'Tis the wounding wand which Loki plucked beneath the doors of the dead. Sinmara keeps it with 9 fast locks, shut in sea lover's chest. Here we have a reference to the Egyptian ark or swan ship in which the talismans were kept. The dialogue continues. Youth. Now answer me, much wise, this that I ask, and fain would learn from thy lips. What hall is yonder, all girt around by enchanted flickering flames? Much wise. Ember 'tis called, and long must it quiver, as though on the spear's point set. Far tidings only throughout all time man hears of this wondrous hall. Youth. Now answer me, much wise, this that I ask, and fain would learn from thy lips. What hill is that on whose height I see yon wondrous woman resting? Much wise. 'Tis the hill of healing, long hath it held, for the sick and sorrowful, joy. Each woman is healed who climbs its height, even of year-long ills. The youth then explains why he has come, but much wise tells him that only the sun god can wed Menglod. This is true in the sense that she is no mortal maid, whom a man can possess, but a crystal which the sun's rays alone can transpierce. Much wise. There is never being in the world may lie in Menglod's soft arms sleeping, save Dayspring, to whom of yore was given that sun-bright maid as bride. The youth at last discloses his identity. He himself is none other than Dayspring, and he commands, "Fling open the door, make wide the gate. Dayspring is here, behold. Yet hie thee first, and find the truth, if Menglod longs for my love." All ends happily, for Menglod replies, "Long have I sat on the hill of healing, awaiting thee day by day, till that I, looked for at length, is come. Thou art back, youth, here in my halls." Verses from the Poetic Edda are taken from the translation by Olive Bray. The Hill of Healing is probably Glastonbury Tor, and the youth is identified with the sun, just as King Arthur was. And the reason why the legend still persists that Arthur is asleep in a cave but will come again is because the old pagans hoped to reinstate the ancient ritual and see the great bell torch issue from the grotto. We come now to the account of the Chapel Perilous. It will be remembered that Lancelot entered a haunted chapel and removed Christ's grave clothes, i.e. the veil of a cup. The vessel is not described, but he issued from the chapel with a new sword. Gawain also visits the Chapel Perilous, but there is no account of his unveiling the talisman, though doubtless he did so. I shall confine myself, therefore, to the account of Perceval's adventure in the Conte du Grail, because in this passage we have the whole story, and furthermore it is the oldest version. My own interpretation is that the account describes a purer ritual of much later date than the original bloodthirsty battle at Nemi. It seems rather to be an initiatory ordeal, such as the Egyptians might have instituted, wherein the hero fights with spiritual powers of darkness rather than an actual Nemean priest. Perceval pays 2 visits to the Chapel Perilous. On the first occasion he sees a corpse upon the altar, and before it burns 1 candle and one only. Devant Louis, I, Ciergis arduit, ne plus ne mains, ne en, I avoid. He then beholds a great brightness. Si vit une molt grande clarté, but knew not whence it proceeded. Then came a terrible clap of thunder, as though the place would tumble into ruins. Uns escrois qui tel noise fist, que il lit semblait que caist, la capelle et debrisast tout. Then from behind the altar came a black hand which extinguished the candle. Une noire mans jusqu'au couste si apparut derrière la autel, la candole qui arduit clair, estant ainsi qu'on vit goûter ni. Perceval, full of awe and dread, leaves the chapel. Later, when he is riding through a wood, he meets one of the maidens of the Grail castle. He tells her of how he has seen a burning tree, and of this adventure in the haunted chapel, and she explains to him that these mysteries concern the Grail. Ciertes, se dist la demoiselle, Sire tu est senefiance del Saint Grail et de la lance. But she will say no more, for she is under pledge of secrecy. Mais Dieu ne place que jaisse de ma bouche nulle parole. On the occasion of Percival's second and successful visit to the Grail Castle, he asks the rich fisher concerning these mysteries. The fisher king replies that more than 4,000 men have perished in the Chapel Perilous, which was built by Brandemore, another name for Brandigan, and that she is buried beneath the altar. The king explains that to exorcise the evil and overcome the Black Hand, Percival must take the veil from a shrine, dip it in holy water, and sprinkle the chapel. Baius dus amis qui combatroit, fait les rois à celle main noire, et puis précost en y amour. Y volet blanc qui y est mis, que en segarde ali anemis, se les personnes malioit, et puis en leve benoit, le boutast sans faire trestor, et arusast tresut en tour, et hotel at cours et capelle, par celui du que en epiel, jamais nous mas ni avenroit, mais hardit estre covenroit, qui à la main veroit combattre. Percival sets out upon the adventure. Through storm and rain and wind he rides through the forest, ties his horse to a tree outside the chapel, and enters. The dead knight, the altar, and the candle are there as before, but this time the Black Hand issues from a window. Que d'un fenestre se but, un mains noir jusqu'au couste. M. Potvin explains in his printing of the Comte du Grail that puits should not be translated as a well but as a grotto, that is to say, a cave. As soon as the Black Hand has extinguished the flame, the vault takes on a leaden hue, and Percival finds it so dark that he might, says the poet, have been in a cave. A most significant description, for there is little doubt that that was just exactly where he was. Des qui li cierges fuestans, devint li cius, torbles etans, il ne vit leons but puis, nient plus que ciel fusten y me puis. Percival then draws his sword, and the terrible combat with the Black Hand begins. Awful noises are heard, as though thunderbolts are being hurled from the vault. The devil, for the Black Hand is that of Satan himself, warns Percival that unless he withdraws, his body shall lie upon the altar tomorrow. Each time that Percival makes the sign of the cross, the devil answers with such claps of thunder as would have killed with terror a less heroic knight. Percival cannot approach the veil because the devil will not let him pass. At last the good knight makes the sign of the cross with his sword, and the most fearful noise yet heard beats him to his knees, half fainting. Et maintenant lieve y espart, et del ciel uns tunoals part, en un effondre perelus, si tres grands et si merveilleux, conquisi si grands ne fut vu, par cheval, trouble le vieux, et kai el musier, pasmes, mais nien pas estre blasmes. But the devil has been overcome by this last sign of the cross. For easier reading, I will give a translation of what follows. In the precincts close by the altar, Percival lay prostrate a goodly space, bereft of his senses, so sorely had the falling thunderbolt stunned and bewildered him. Returning to his dwelling, the body, he went with all haste to the shrine, drew it towards him, and opened it. There, within the shrine, he discovered a vessel of gold, and without stay or hindrance took out the white veil just as the king, who had revealed all that was to be, had shown him. He sprinkles the precincts with the veil dipped in holy water, and puts back the golden vessel into its shrine. Then he looks at the dead knight upon the altar and thinks that no one could recognize him, so black and ugly is his face. Thereafter, exhausted by his initiatory ordeal, Percival lies down to sleep. In that place he lay until morning, for no light had appeared there, nor did it, until the very moment when day began to dawn. For on that day was lit the candle which has never since been extinguished, nor shall it be until the world comes to an end. There within the midmost chapel the worthy Percival fell asleep until morning, when the sun's rays appeared therein, clear and ruby red. At that Percival awoke, bewildered by the radiance, and saw the candle burning. Long he remained thus, gazing upon the lighted candle, and marveling whence it had been lit, for he was well aware, he knew and saw indeed that it had been kindled by the hand of God. When Percival leaves the caverns of Wookiee, he has won his name, which means, so Wolfram von Eschenbach assures us, to pierce the veil, that is to say, an initiate who has passed through the veil of the dead. We have in this account two conflicting ideas: an initiation wherein Percival wonders at the power of the Grail to bring down fire from heaven, and the latter legend of how Wookiee Hole was exorcised by a Christian monk, a local tale which we shall come to in a chapter dealing with Christian times. It should perhaps be added that Lancelot's adventures in La Dolorous Gard, described as situated near the river Humber, are yet another version of an initiatory experience. He was led to a chapel in which was a door leading to a cave. The keys of the enchantment were in the cave. As he entered, the earth quaked and noise filled the air. Two knights of copper holding huge swords, almost certainly they were originally brands, were posted at the entrance of the next chamber. The two figures with brands at the entrance to a Mithraeum are discussed on page 251. In front of another door was an evil-smelling deep well, from which ghastly noises arose. On the opposite side of the water was an ugly monster with a black head and flaming breath. Lancelot was victorious and obtained the keys, wherewith he was able to open the perilous coffer. A whirlwind arose from it, as if all the devils had been freed. There is here a similarity to Pandora's box. See page 224. Here, I think, the original ordeal of Wookiee has become confused with a much later Mithraic ritual, possibly connected with some local Mithraeum near the Humber.
Part 2, The Two Worlds. The Dream. Once upon a time, I, Chuang Tzu, a leading Taoist or follower of Lao Tse, who flourished during the 4th century BC, dreamt that I was a butterfly fluttering hither and thither, to all intents and purposes a butterfly. I was conscious only of following my fancies as a butterfly, and was unconscious of my individuality as a man. Suddenly I awakened, and there I lay, myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a man. Between a man and a butterfly there is necessarily a barrier. The transition is called metempsychosis. Chuang Tzu, translated by Herbert A. Giles. This late Greek term, metempsychosis, commonly translated the transmigration of souls, was of course not current in Chuang Tzu's time and environment, in which, to the best of my knowledge, the relevant concept did not exist in the crude form which it later assumed, i.e. that the individual principle of one being migrated after death into the body of another. Richard Wilhelm, a later translator, renders this last sentence, "Thus it is with the transformations of things." This question will be elaborated later. 1. Walter Mitty. A figure which has gripped the popular imagination in the same way as Miss Blandish's did, taking its place in the second rank behind such leading personalities in contemporary mythology as Sherlock Holmes, Jekyll and Hyde, Alice, Tarzan, and Peter Pan, is that of Thurber's Walter Mitty, the pathetic, ineffectual, henpecked little man who is perpetually losing himself in dreams of glory,
is a figure of whom almost everybody has heard, even if he has not read the original sketch. Mitty, in fact, has been accepted as a formulation of something real in the collective mind. His function, I think, is much the same as that of the poignant figure created by Chaplin in his earlier films. He serves as a harmless, because wryly humorous, release for our self-pity. Self-pity is a dangerous weakness which we may easily degenerate into a victimization complex and a permanent grudge against the world. But this occurs only when it is repressed. In itself, it is a natural reaction, for we try so hard, and the intentions of most of us are so good, but we are forever being frustrated and misunderstood by an obtuse, perverse, and intractable world which goes its own way, refusing to accommodate itself to our good intentions. If we take the trouble to think about it, we know perfectly well why this is so. It is because good intentions are not enough. It is necessary to learn in the hard school of practical experience how they can be made effective in a refractory world which was not made to our order. There is a danger, however, that we may not take the trouble to think about it. Instead, we build up a private system of self-justification based on the feelings of resentment and humiliation occasioned by our failures. As soon as we become aware of this tendency, we are, to be sure, forearmed. We can catch ourselves in the act of cherishing feelings of self-pity and resentment. We can point out to ourselves that they are foolish and unworthy, and dismiss them without more ado. But unfortunately, this course, apparently so sensible and full of insight, represents the essence of that mental pattern which we have seen symbolized in Fenner's subservience to Blandish, and the latter's exploitation of the ex-journalist's right of entry to the underworld in order to frustrate the attempts at regeneration. The intuitive faculty, Fenner, provides the conscious mind with information concerning what is going on in the unconscious, but it is essential that the information be utilized in a tolerant and conciliatory spirit, and not perverted by the conscious attitude to subserve its own despotic repression of all that is uncongenial to it in the unconscious. If the subject's situation evokes a feeling reaction such as self-pity or resentment, then that feeling must be accepted and faced as a reality, possessing its own inherent justification, irrespective of what view the conscious mind may make of it. If it appears unworthy and unsuitable to the circumstances, it must certainly be prevented as far as from possible from affecting the subject's actual behavior in important matters. But it must on no account be brushed aside as unworthy of consideration. The latter course evokes in the subject even more unsuitable and unadmitted feelings, this time of superiority and self-righteousness, which will color his attitude and affect his behavior without his realizing it. His last state is therefore worse than his first. There is an anecdote of a man, I think George Moore, who had been unintentionally but culpably injured by another. When the latter came to apologize, the victim, instead of concealing his resentment behind the conventional and therefore expected mask of magnanimous forgivingness, greeted him with the words, "Go away, I never want to see you again." This reaction may appear, and indeed it was, pettish and self-indulgent, yet if forgiveness did not spring spontaneously from the heart, the outburst was in many respects better than a false and uncritical pardon, which would have poisoned the relationship between the two men indefinitely, and left the injured party wallowing in unadmitted self-adulation. The childish outburst was, perhaps, reprehensible, yet it finished with the matter once and for all, and was much fairer to the culprit. This trivial story illustrates, by the censorious criticism which it evokes in most people, how apt we are to judge our feelings according to principles, and therein lies the danger of disowning them, which may develop into an ingrained and vicious habit which distorts the whole personality. Feelings cannot be reasoned out of existence. If we refuse them consideration for whatever reason, however praiseworthy in itself, they descend into the unconscious, where they accumulate and fester. In the end, they find means of evading the repression of the conscious attitude, and of expressing themselves in ways which are far more objectionable, and generally more harmful, than a little spontaneous self-pity and resentment. Therefore, we must learn to accept our self-pity and live it out, because we cannot get rid of it in any other way. In this connection, such figures as those of Mitty and the early chaplain are helpful. Don Quixote is another example, on a more heroic scale, for they evoke a compassionate pity for the absurd, well-intentioned little man, who is forever being made a fool of in his attempts to bring a little kindliness, or some color and excitement, into a hard-headed, tough, unsympathetic, humdrum world, which is ruled by mean trivialities. Their function is cathartic, for they release feelings which most of us really entertain about ourselves, but disown as unworthy. The essential point is that Mitty's position is a universal human one, for even the toughest and most hard-headed individuals suffer in some way from this distressing paradox. We all live in two worlds, and often have difficulty in reconciling the two. The only difference between individuals in this respect is that some are more conscious of the fact than others. To put the matter in its most prosaic terms, things are not always as we should like them to be, or think they ought to be, and we are faced with the problem of either changing the outer world to accord with our desires, or of adapting our requirements to it as we find it. Conversely, of course, things are not always as bad as we feared they might be, in which case we are thankful. But in either case, we are faced with the contrast between two conceptions, of things as they are, and things as they might be. The real world. For so long as we concern ourselves merely with concrete cases, the problem seems simple and obvious enough. We live in a real world which exists independently of us, having its own characteristic nature, and following its own inherent laws. In our minds we imagine situations concerning which we believe, rightly or wrongly, that they exist or could exist in the real world. If we are right in our supposition, then the real world behaves as we expect it to behave when we apply our ideas to it, and thus we succeed in our purpose. If, on the other hand, we were wrong, and the situation we have imagined does not exist or is incapable of existing in the real world, we receive an unpleasant shock when the two are confronted. Our task, therefore, would seem to be simply to discover as much as we can about the real world and the laws according to which it operates. Once we have succeeded in understanding it fully, we shall no longer make mistakes, but we shall no longer attempt things which are impossible, or at any rate unsuited to the circumstances of the moment. When we look a little deeper, however, we find that the position is not quite so simple. In the first place, our thoughts and imaginings are by no means confined to the real world, for we are also interested not only in abstractions which have only the remotest connection with it, if they have any at all, but also in situations, in fictions, legend, and fable, which are frankly impossible in the context of the outer world, and which we freely admit to be so. These matters undoubtedly have value for us, for humanity has always prized them, and there can be no question that they exercise at least an indirect effect on our outer lives. There must, therefore, exist what we may describe as an inner world, a world of thought and imagination, which exists separately from the outer world which we call real, and is in many respects independent of it. Apparent subjectivity of the inner world. At first, we are apt to assume that this inner world is merely subjective. Everybody, we think, has his own, which we need have no connection with that of anybody else, whereas the outer world is the same for everybody. This assumption, however, is also open to question. The matter will be elaborated as we proceed, but we have already adduced a considerable quality of evidence which suggests that certain basic images, such as that of Miss Blandish, Persephone, Helen, have a habit of appearing spontaneously in the minds of the most various individuals at the most diverse times and places. When these archetypal images appear, moreover, they tend to behave autonomously in accordance with ascertainable laws which are in many respects equivalent to the laws governing the phenomena of the outer world, although differing from them. It thus appears that there is a definite objective element in the inner world, which is, to some extent, the same for all individuals in the same sense as the outer world is. The subjective element in the outer world. Turning now to the outer world, we are compelled to admit that although it appears to be completely objective, i.e., the same for everybody, this common element is confined to its basic principles, for each individual experience of it is essentially different from any other. Even if two people are looking at the same object at the same time, they cannot see exactly the same picture, if only because they are necessarily looking at it from points of view which are different, however slightly. Each, to be sure, normally constructs from his visual impression a mental picture of a three-dimensional object, which he can imagine from any point of view, and thus, so long as the object is familiar and can be clearly seen, both observers will draw identical conclusions from what they see. But such conclusions exist solely in the mind. They are interpretations of sensory data which each observer makes on his own account, and it is easy to imagine cases in which their interpretations may differ materially. If, for instance, they are looking at an unfamiliar object from opposite sides, they may come to very different conclusions regarding its three-dimensional form. And when we go on to consider their conclusions as to the nature, purpose, and potentialities of the object, it is obvious that their conclusions may differ even more widely. The conclusions of a savage and a civilized man, for instance, may be imagined when they observe a television set in action. It is thus evident that the outer or real world exists very largely in the mind of the individual. He draws conclusions from his immediate sensory experience, i.e., from the images on his retina, the vibrations of his eardrums, and the pressure of the skin of his fingers, i.e., from the images on his retina, the vibrations of his eardrums, and the pressure on the skin of his fingers, in accordance with preconceived images in his mind. In other words, he recognizes what he sees, hears, feels, tastes, and smells by comparing the immediate data with mental images, most of which are built up from experience, but some of which, as we know, are innate. He then interprets what he has recognized in accordance with his individual subjective knowledge and understanding of the outer world, the objects it contains and their relationships with one another. It is on this complex and largely subjective basis that the conclusion regarding what he is experiencing rests, and this conclusion is probably the only part of the whole sequence which reaches consciousness. It may justifiably be objected that the outer world must be completely objective after all. Astronomers, for instance, predict an eclipse years in advance, and at the due moment it is visible to every single observer in the predicted area, and in absolutely identical form. The phenomenon, moreover, may be photographically recorded, and the individual impressions of the observers confirmed by comparison with the picture. It is perfectly true that an absolutely objective element in our experience of the outer world may be determined if we take enough trouble to circumscribe it, and we are able to assume on the account and we are apt to assume on that account that if we only took enough trouble and had enough understanding, we might succeed in reducing the whole of outer existence to objective terms. Even scientists, however, are beginning to discover limits to this process of objectivization. Even scientists, however, are beginning to discover limits to this process of objectivization within their own most special spheres, e.g. in the principle of indeterminacy in the Heisenberg limits. The same consideration, moreover, undoubtedly applies to the inner world. We are already beginning to discern objective elements in it, and we have not as yet devoted to this sphere of experience 1/10,000th part of the attention. 1/10,000th part of the attention that has been devoted to the outer world in the course of the last 2 centuries. Equivalence of the relationship of the subject to inner and outer worlds. If we accept the hypothesis that the individual does not independently create his thoughts and imaginings, but simply perceives what is presented from an inner source, in exactly the same way as he perceives the data of the senses or outer source, it will become apparent that his relationship to the inner world is basically the same as his relationship to the outer. Neither is inherently more or less objective, nor universally true than the other, any apparent disparity in these respects being almost certainly attributable solely to the difference in the amount of attention which has been directed in modern times to the 2 spheres. Thus, if the subject bases his interpretation of his inner experience on the methods which he is accustomed to use in interpreting outer experience, he will be just as certain to make mistakes and experience disappointments as he will if he does the reverse. The 2 worlds as mental systems of interpretation. There are thus sufficient grounds for assuming a priori that the 2 alternative, contrasting, largely incompatible modes of experience are universal in the civilized mind, and that each individual builds up on the basis of his experience of each of them 2 separate bodies of knowledge, or systems of principles and values, which he uses to interpret his actual experiences. It is in these complex images, not in the immediate perceptions themselves, that his true experience of life, i.e. of meaning, is to be found. Thus, if he hears a speech in an unknown tongue, he experiences nothing but sound, but if it is in a familiar language, he already possesses a complete mental image of sounds, words, and syntax, with which he can compare the sensory data from his ears. Thus, he hears not sound, but meaning. Similarly, when a certain pattern is projected onto the retina of his eyes, he sees not forms and colors, but, let us say, a chair or a human being. The ordinary individual in a highly civilized community is not conscious of forms and colors as such at all, unless they are exceptionally conspicuous, or unless he has some extraneous reason for concentrating on them. What he sees, i.e. what reaches consciousness, is a conception or notion, such as chair, old man, etc. This fact becomes apparent when he approaches works of art. He reads off a picture in the same way as he is accustomed to read the illustrations in the newspaper, interpreting their notional meaning and no more. In order to learn to appreciate works of art, most people have to undergo a course of instruction in what to look for, which means rather what to ignore. They have to learn that the painter is not concerned simply with producing a reproduction of, say, an apple, which is recognizable to anybody as a kind of fruit which he commonly eats, but with communicating a particular visual impression in terms of form and color, which has little or no connection with the meaning of the apple as an edible fruit. Experiments with school children have shown that the true appreciation of artistic values is considerably lower in highly civilized communities than in more backward ones. This is because the highly civilized children have already carried the process of interpretation of the original sensory data to a higher degree of selectivity in one particular direction. Their images of the outer world are more highly developed in a one-sided thinking pattern which screens and rejects the straight response to the sensory stimulus as such, proceeding instead direct to the conceptual notion that's meant to be an apple. The typical contemporary mind, having reached this point, sees no possibility of proceeding further, and asks, "So what?" But that is only because he knows what these objects are and recognizes the essential features characteristic of the visual impression produced by them when seen from a variety of different viewpoints. When the viewpoint is unfamiliar, e.g. a human being seen directly from above, he may have difficulty in identifying the image. In the same way, once he has become familiar with, for instance, the characteristic impressions produced by the symbol which we have identified as the anima, he will be able to identify it as it is presented from a number of different individual viewpoints, in fiction, in his dreams, etc. In both cases, he is comparing a particular perception with a generalized image pre-existent in the mind. If all the images connected with and derived from outer experience are brought together, classified, and arranged in a coherent, consistent, and intelligible system, they constitute the subject's individual picture of the outer world. But this, it is found, leaves a certain amount of material unprovided for. This is of an irrational, symbolical, mystical, occult, coincidental, and obscure nature. It is my contention that it is possible to arrange this material into a corresponding and opposed pattern of the inner world. This can be just as coherent, consistent, and intelligible as that of the outer world, although the system of classification and reference required to make it so differs widely from that which is appropriate for the outer world material. The reason why so few people nowadays make any serious attempt to do this is simply that the contemporary outlook is so strongly prejudiced in favor of the outer world system that we take it for granted that it is the only possible one. Material must either be fitted into our outer world picture, or we believe it cannot be fitted into any intelligible picture at all. Consequently, when we meet with anomalous material, we either do violence to its inherent inner world nature by forcing it into the Procrustean bed of our outer world system, or we attempt to explain it away as merely subjective, or, in other words, unreal. At this point, I am begging the question of the possibility of two alternative and intrinsically opposed and incompatible methods of interpretation, each of which can produce a coherent and intelligible system. It is a hypothesis, and we have yet to discover to what extent it is capable of explaining the phenomena which we actually experience. These two systems, or complex images by the aid of which we interpret life, are, if taken as wholes, of unimaginable intricacy and scope, and it is justifiable to call them worlds. They are, in fact, the only worlds we know, for our conceptions of any world or part of a world outside our own minds are only projections of the images inside them. Very often we do not realize that there are often two of them. The outer world, we believe, is the only one which really exists. Everything else in our minds is just nonsense, or fancy, or superstition, or psychology. But, in fact, as will shortly become apparent, we do not constantly discriminate between the two, and this implies the existence of an image of the inner world, however nebulous and incomplete it may be in comparison with our rich and highly developed image of the outer. The contemporary mentality, in fact, is strongly prejudiced against the inner world in all but one respect, that of rational thought, which simply means that we are incapable of making sense of it, just as we are incapable of making sense of speech in an unknown tongue. This study is mainly concerned with the manner in which the awareness of this duality of experience works its way into consciousness, of how the images of the two worlds are built up, and of the respects in which, when fully developed, they are found to differ. The mind and the brain. We think that we know where the outer world is, and it is hardly necessary to warn the intelligent reader against the ingenuous assumption, common in more primitive thought, that the inner world is in another place, e.g., above the sky or beyond the sea, or the mountains, It is, however, perhaps advisable to make it clear from the start that one is not inside our head and the other outside. This is the basic misconception against which we have to fight, and the background and causation of which will become apparent as we progress. The contemporary picture of the world, which is accepted as self-evident by even the majority of leaders of thought, is that of a host of individual minds, often confused with brains, each confined within its own individual skull, and all contained in a common outer world which exists in its own right, independently of them, and is the same for all of them. At least it would be the same if only they could understand it properly. For the sole function of these brains is to form a picture of the outer world, as revealed to them through the organs of sense, which shall correspond as closely as possible with its workings, again as revealed by the organs of sense. It is generally assumed and often expressly stated that the only things which the subject can know with certainty are those which have been revealed to his brain as a result of sensory experiences, and the sole purpose of knowledge or understanding is seen as the correlation of the sensory experiences of the past in such a way that those of the future can be predicted. The consequence of this attitude is that the mind comes to be regarded as a mere function of the brain, and it is this misconception which gives rise to most of our difficulties. The brain is a physical object, situated at a precise point in time and space. It possesses extensions in the form of the organs of sense, which provide it with information regarding the position which it occupies in relation to other material objects, thereby defining that position and giving it a central or nuclear quality. The mind, on the other hand, although in its personal aspect it is linked to one brain or another, is by no means exclusively confined to any point in time and space. The mind, on the other hand, although in its personal aspect, is by no means exclusively confined to any point in time and space. Time, space, and material objects, including the brain and the sense organs, are contained in the mind, not the mind in them. Time and space, of course, cannot be perceived in themselves, but only as relationships between objects, states, or situations. While personal consciousness is normally very largely determined or shaped by the precise position in time and space of the brain with which it is associated, it is perfectly capable of escaping this bondage and turning instead to the other aspects of mind which are not so confined. This latter aspect of mind is commonly unconscious, i.e., personal consciousness is averted from it, but it is always available as an alternative mode of experience, and some individuals who are gifted in this respect make use of it frequently, and are often even capable of making the transition, passing through the barrier, at will. This matter will become clearer as we progress. The contemporary prejudice against accepting mind as something separate from, and to some extent independent of, the brain, is, however, extremely hard to eradicate and cannot be attacked too often. Let it then be repeated: the inner world is not confined within our heads, nor is the outer world confined outside them. Both are aspects of the mind. The Two Worlds of Walter Mitty. Yonder see the morning blink, the sun is up, and up must I, to wash and dress and eat and drink, and look at things and talk and think, and work, and God knows why. Oh, often have I washed and dressed, and what's to show for all my pain? Let me lie abed and rest. 10,000 times I've done my best, and all's to do again. A.E. Housman, Last Poems. Most people must have felt at some time or other the tragedy and horror of the daily return to the bondage of this world. That misery immortally rendered in terms of the human body in Michelangelo's figure of Dawn on the Medici tombs. She doesn't seem to be very happy about it. Somebody seeing a picture of this reluctant awakening for the first time once said to me. Indeed, she does not, but how many people have seen the point? Reference has already been made in connection with no orchids to the delights of the other side, and the cheerlessness of this world when contrasted to it. One more example of the expression of this feeling, taken this time from a highly reputable source, may complete the picture. Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight, and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices, that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again, and then, in dreaming, the clouds, methought, would open and show riches, ready to drop upon me, that, when I waked, I cried to dream again. Caliban in the Tempest. Prospero's Island, as we shall see when we come to analyze the play in a later volume, is a symbol of the inner world. This inner world, which is in some respects so much pleasanter, although in others so much less pleasant, and nearly always so much more exciting, colorful and full of meaning than the outer, cannot be simply dismissed as the expression of longings for pleasures which we have once enjoyed, but lack at the moment in our outer world. It is no mere substitute for real experience, but a complete alternative to it, existing in its own right. It is true, of course, that we are often led to turn to it as a refuge from an unsatisfactory outer life, but, on the other hand, it often forces itself on us, not infrequently in unpleasant forms, quite of its own accord. This, incidentally, is the difficulty with which Freud was confronted, and which he attempted to explain away, in my view quite unsuccessfully in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. If we are open-minded, we are compelled to admit that virtually everybody is more or less distinctly aware of an alternative mode of experience in which things have a totally different significance from that which they have in the outer world, and in which they conform to totally different laws. They long to hear of arduous journeys to fantastic places, of catastrophic loves, and even of extravagant torments, not because they have ever experienced anything even remotely resembling these situations in their personal lives, but simply because the stories have symbolical significance. They are enabled to experience the symbolical pattern in imagination, and the symbol, being a living force and no mere allegory, acts on the mind, relieving tensions and showing the way out of deadlocks. When, on rare occasions, such symbolical patterns do appear in the outer lives, they experience them, of course, with even greater intensity. But on such occasions, the very intensity of the experience produces repercussions in that part of the mind which is oriented towards outer experience, which are so powerful that they tend to be overwhelming. Hence, such experiences as invariably disturbing, and are generally unpleasant rather than pleasant. In the end, the clear-cut symbolical significance tends to be lost, becoming overlaid by the multitude of practical repercussions which it engenders, and the very few people who have gone through really dramatic experiences have any desire to repeat them, although they will talk of them endlessly. An outstanding example of the overpowering and crushing effect of such coincidences of the two worlds will be seen when we come in a later volume to consider the case of T.E. Lawrence. It is only the tough and insensitive who are capable of enduring much symbolical content in their outer lives. Thus, fantasies and an interest in the inner world in general are not to be regarded as morbid symptoms of maladjustment to the outer world. On the contrary, they are the signs of a very healthy adjustment to it. An understanding and objective interest in the fantastic, the dramatic, and even the sensational are evidence that the subject is aware of mental needs which cannot possibly be satisfied in his outer life, without disrupting it completely. He therefore very wisely satisfies them in the inner world. He recognizes the primary necessity of maintaining himself as a responsible and productive agent in the outer world, and he knows that this task is a difficult one, which can only be accomplished by a patient and preserving concentration on his outer life. There is no scope there for the volcanic and shattering manifestations of the spirit, which is the pure essence of the active power of the inner world. But such a concentration on the harsh and dreary necessities of the outer life leaves something in the mind uncatered for, and he experiences a craving for the wider horizons in the intenser, more dramatic life of the other side. If he is wise, he will not dismiss this craving as a temptation to waste time and energy in escapism, but will offer it the expression and the scope it demands. When he finds waking unbearable and cries to dream again, he will allow himself to dream, or if he lacks talent for it, he will participate in the dreams of the storytellers. He must, however, beware of one mistake, which is the mistake of Walter Mitty. That is to identify his outer world personality with his inner world experiences. The Secret Life of Walter Mitty is Thurber's masterpiece, but its theme is by no means unique in his writings, many of which hinge on this contrast between fact and fancy. General Walter Mitty appears as the writer who never tires of presenting the unworldly, unpractical, fantasy-ridden personality, which he implies is his own, in its humorously painful collisions with the prosaic outer world of machinery, policemen, and domestic servants. Yet behind the wry self-depreciation may be discerned an insistence, sometimes gentle but at times almost arrogant, on the fundamental superiority of this incompetent and indecisive yet poetic figure, which he makes himself out to be, over all the hard-headed and efficient persons who form his environment and who think so highly of themselves. But he has also another vein in which he mildly ridicules all that is pretentious, or that lacks a sense of proportion, or that horse sense, which spontaneously discriminates between the factual and the fanciful. His insistence on the compensatory superiority of the Mitty type, and its justification in its own right, is wholesome, for the contemporary world is inclined to accept extrovert values too uncritically. Hard-headedness, efficiency, and competence are its gods, and it is all too apt to overlook the fact that these virtues, valuable though they undoubtedly are, tend to crush and suppress the delicate growths of the mind. Life, the Tao Te Ching says, is soft, tender, and fragile, like the bud. The basic work of the Taoist movement, traditionally ascribed to Lao Tse, but in the opinion of modern scholars, a compilation from various writers including Lao Tse, probably made in the 3rd century BC, see Arthur Waley, The Way and Its Power. It is death which is hard and tough, like the seasoned timber. The success of a Thurber suggests that contemporary people are in need of some little comfort and reassurance in face of the harsh demands of the blandish system. This unworthy trend in Thurber is at first sight hard to reconcile with the insistence on realistic common sense and sobriety of statement, the tendency to debunk which we have also noted. If he insists on the value of fantasy and of the irrational over against the intransigently practical, utilitarian standpoint, then why does he so subtly attack, with a trenchancy graciously concealed by his mild and almost apologetic tone, such extravagances as Salvador Dali's autobiography and the theses of those purveyors of popular psychology who attribute road accidents to the idea that a motor car is a sexual symbol, because of the mechanical principle involved? The answer is that he makes a fine distinction between two worlds, those of fancy and of fact. Probably he does not visualize the matter in these terms, yet his writings are a perpetual affirmation of his intuitive apperception of the truth that the two worlds exist. Fantasy, he asserts, has value, however irrational it may be, or rather precisely because of that irrationality. It is the enemy of the factual, down-to-earth, practical attitude which is perpetually trying to suppress it. The man who is gifted with fantasy and who lives a part of his life in a world of imaginings is forever at loggerheads with the outer world of facts and its ineluctable demands. He makes a fool of himself when faced with the simplest practical problems. Mitty cannot even park his car efficiently, and is despised by his fellows and his wife. Yet he feels superior to those who lack his gift, for he knows that his inner values are real. Yet at the same time, those who possess the gift of changing the scene of consciousness from the outer to the inner world, from the realm of fact to that of fancy, must forever be on their guard against the danger of overlooking and underrating the requirements of the former, and of distorting their perception of its true nature in accordance with the requirements of fantasy or theory. Thus, Thurber insists that facts in the world of practical living have their own validity and obey their own laws, which are totally different from those obtaining in the world of fancy. These laws and the pattern of this outer world must be recognized and respected. That is why he is moved to scornful attacks against those who impose their theories and their fantasies onto factual material in defiance of the totally different patterns of the factual world. It is also the reason why he is forever describing the absurd predicaments into which he and those like him are constantly falling when they come into contact with the intractable world of matter, and of human prejudices and presuppositions. Fact and fancy, he inferentially insists, must be kept strictly separate, for they are irreconcilable. Seeing himself in the unpleasant situation of living at the point of collision of these two powerful and irreconcilable forces, he is a little sorry for himself and makes a determined effort to overcome his sufferings, which, like those of all such people, are real enough, by laughing at them. Humor is an invaluable aid in smoothing over the minor frictions of terrestrial life, yet it must not be allowed to obscure basic problems, and the irreconcilability of the two worlds is a very real problem which must be tackled in all seriousness. A valuable first step in escaping the dilemma in which we find ourselves is precisely this, of visualizing these two modes of experience as two separate worlds which, while they interpenetrate, are of two diverse and incompatible natures. This is the symbolism of the two interpenetrating triangles called the Star of David. This conception is, of course, no more than a heuristic aid towards understanding the problem. The two worlds are neither of them objective facts, although many of their contents are, and every entity which is perceived by a consciousness exists concurrently in both of them. What we are concerned with is the form in which anything appears in consciousness, i.e., the manner in which it has been shaped and interpreted in those levels of the mind which select and form the objects of consciousness. The nature of the ultimate image in consciousness, which is what we conceive the external object to be, depends on, among other things, whether outer or inner world principles have been employed in its selection and shaping. The story of Walter Mitty is a brilliant exposition of this theme. Its most striking feature is that the passages of the conscious mind from one world to the other are made without transition or indication of the change. At one moment we are being told of the thrilling experience of a naval commander taking a giant hydroplane through a hurricane, and in the next paragraph, without a word of explanation, we find poor Mitty being reprimanded by his wife for driving the car too fast. He passes the hospital, and suddenly we are in the operating theater with Mitty performing prodigies of surgery. If told conventionally, of course, the narrative would contain explanatory transitions. The sight of the hospital evoked pictures in Mitty's mind of what was going on inside. Probably he thought an operation was in progress at this moment. A human life lay in the balance. Everything depended on the surgeon's skill. Suddenly the scene took shape before him. He saw himself, etc. The result would be a trite description of a pipe dreamer's fantasies, but Thurber's method leaves the reader with a delighted thrill of perception, to make the discoveries for himself. Of course, he's imagining all this. It is in gratitude for that thrill of triumphant understanding that the reader remembers the story with pleasure. It is unlikely that he realizes that he has been put in the way of understanding far more. For the point of the story is not the fact which everybody knows, that people in general, and more particularly perhaps the ineffectual and unsuccessful, are given to seeking compensation for the poverty and disagreeableness of the experiences afforded them in the outer world, by availing themselves of the richer and more colorful experiences provided by fancy. It is far rather that the consciousness of Walter Mitty, which is no more than an artistically exaggerated type of human consciousness in general, exists alternately in two modes, and that, so far as that consciousness is concerned, there are no grounds for saying that either of them is more real than the other. This question of reality is of the essence of the problem. It will form the subject of the next chapter, and for the moment we may content ourselves with noting that the exclusive reality of the outer world, by which, for the moment, I mean that which we may touch or see, is by no means so self-evident as it might appear at first sight. At other times and in other places, indeed, the prevailing prejudice has been of the opposite nature. The civilization of ancient India, for example, was founded on a philosophy of life which insisted that the material universe was a mere illusion, and that reality was to be found only in the mind. Even in our own Middle Ages, the inner life, often seen as the afterlife of the soul, was definitely valued more highly than the life in this world. It may at first sight appear absurd to see such abstruse philosophical ideas in the humorous little sketch of Walter Mitty, but philosophical ideas need not necessarily be expressed in philosophical form. Or, to put it in another way, the philosophical is only one of the possible forms in which an idea can be expressed. It is essentially an academic and intellectual form, from which all but logical and conceptual elements have been rigorously excluded. But the idea, in the Platonic sense, being a reality on the archetypal level, is a pattern which embraces aesthetic, symbolical, and feeling values besides the intellectual, and it may be brought to the expression in any of these media just as well as truly as in a philosophical dissertation. The archetypal idea of the two worlds is clearly expressed in Beethoven's music, and there is no reason at all why it should not become manifest in a humorous sketch by Thurber. The basic pattern is there to be seen in the insistence on the equal validity of Mitty's two modes of experience. The conventional novelist describing Mitty would have used some such forms as I've indicated above. Taking the outer world Mitty as the point of reference, he would have insisted that here was the reality. The excursions into the world of fantasy would have been described as thoughts produced by this character, precisely on a par with his thoughts about his wife or his car. But Thurber shows us that there are in fact two separate Walter Mittys, united, like Jekyll and Hyde, only by the fact that they share a single stream of consciousness, and must therefore alternate in their possession of it. For the inner, the secret Mitty, is always the same, no matter in which of the trite heroic roles from film or thriller he appears, and the situations in which he finds himself, varied as they are, have the one characteristic in common, that they are as exciting and dramatic as Mitty's outer life is dull and prosaic. The picture of the two contrasting lives and of the two contrasting personalities who live them is brilliantly worked out, with an extraordinary economy of means, and the final impression is that of the two, the inner is the more real. Mitty regards his outer life as no more than a series of vexatious and incoherent interruptions in his far more vividly experienced heroic career. That is why he devotes so little attention to it, and is forever making a mess of his outer world activities. He does not build a fantasy world for himself as a compensation for his incompetence in the outer world. He is incompetent in the outer world because, for him at least, the world of fantasy is so much more real than the world of fact. Here we reach the point mentioned earlier. Mitty's mistake lies in his inability to distinguish between the contrasting natures of the inner and outer worlds, and of the two selves who experience them respectively. It is for this reason that he is a pathetic and, in the last resort, contemptible escapist, who flees from the difficulties of the outer world by taking improper advantages of the facilities of the inner. If he understood the problem, he would be able to appease his unsatisfied craving for the symbolical, the dramatic, and the colorful elements in which his outer life, like most outer lives, is deficient, by the perfectly legitimate and harmless means of imagining exciting situations without seeing his outer world self as their central character and hero. This is the form of imagining of which the creative artist makes use, and Mitty is potentially creative. His only trouble is that he stands in his own light. It is a sufficiently common weakness, and it is because most people know the creative fantasy only in this distorted form that it is commonly regarded as inferior and even harmful. Thurber himself, of course, is perfectly well aware of this fact. And when we turn to the consideration of actual cases, do we really find that it is only or even predominantly the incompetent, the unsuccessful, and those who lead dull lives who indulge in fantasies? From my personal experience, I should say it was rather the reverse, for I have known several individuals whose lives were full of interest and excitement, and who in their way were far from unsuccessful, but who nonetheless indulged in fantasies to a pronounced degree. Such types reveal certain weaknesses in the face of outer world problems. Being generally undependable, lacking in consistent application, and liable to act on occasion with a hair-raising irresponsibility and ineptitude. They may, however, learn to overcome these shortcomings. Often they exhibit outstanding enterprise and determination, and the urge to translate fantasy into fact may provide the incentive to sensational performances. In the study of T.E. Lawrence, a case in point will be considered. Imagination, after all, is indispensable to greatness, and it may well be that the idea that fantasies are nothing but inferior and infantile substitutes for real-life activities is only another product of the contemporary prejudice against the inner world. Fantasies, nevertheless, as the study of Lawrence and still more of Hitler will show, may be dangerous or even catastrophic. This is the case when the subject fails to appreciate the contrasting natures of the two worlds and attempt to coerce the outer world to comply with the pattern of the inner. It is impossible to elaborate this thesis until we have progressed considerably further in the study of the characteristic patterns of the two worlds and their contrasting natures. For the moment, we must content ourselves with the observation that Walter Mitty's dual mode of experience is universal, in a greater or lesser degree, in all human beings. The difference between one individual and another in this respect lies in the degree to which the two modes are brought to consciousness and their irreconcilability appreciated. Variation in the relationship to the two worlds as between individuals. This is a vital point because, as we shall see, there is no universally valid dividing line between the two worlds. They consist, as we have noted, of mental systems according to which diverse experiences are interpreted. The difference lies not in the material itself, but in the manner in which it is, so to speak, processed and given significance in the mind. Thus, to take a simple example, one man will interpret a feeling of depression and malaise in outer world terms, attributing it to his digestion or to the weather, whereas another will see it at once as the symptom of an inner world disturbance, such as dissatisfaction with his progress in life, or even, if he has psychological insight, of the conflict between two purely mental factors. Inner and outer must be regarded as directions like east and west, rather than as fixed areas. No matter where we start, we can always move either eastward or westward, and the line dividing the two depends solely on our position at the moment. Thus, regions which to one individual are the east and to another living further eastward the west, we must overlook the convention whereby even Americans refer to Japan, which lies westward of them, as the Far East. New York to an American is the East, whereas to a European it is the West. Thus, each individual has a mental residence or habitual point of departure in the matter of discriminating between the two worlds, and what is inner to one is outer to another. This analogy, however, must not be pursued too far, for the mind is inherently so constituted that it must work in both directions. It is, however, open to the individual to concentrate his consciousness on either the inward or the outward tendency at the expense of the other, and this process results in the relegation of the neglected tendency to the unconscious, where he is not aware of its functioning and loses control of it. Thus, the inner world, for instance, affects different individuals in different ways. In the unimaginative materialistic type, it barely reaches consciousness at all. He is unaware of inner problems and sees everything in outer world terms. This, up to a point, simplifies life for him. His inner life is embedded in the collectivity and thus conforms to patterns which, in a stable society, have been evolved through centuries of trial and error, and suffice to canalize the impulses emanating from the inner world. These are the mores of his community, the collective ideas and ideals, customs and values in which he has been brought up, and which, except perhaps in matters of detail, he accepts as unquestionably right. Mores, plural of the Latin mos, usage, custom, or conduct, adopted in English as a translation of the German sit, from which there is no exact equivalent. Personally, of course, he is convinced of his own absolute freedom of action and independence of judgment, but in fact most of his actions are dictated and his opinions and judgments formed for him by collective patterns, the action of which he does not perceive. This condition implies that he is entirely dependent on the undisturbed and satisfactory functioning of his community, and on the continuing efficacy of those collective forms which shield him from personal contact with inner world forces. Collective, systematized religion provides a good example of such a shield. As Jung has demonstrated in his Psychology and Religion, its purpose is not to bring man into direct contact with God, but to protect him from it. The direct action of the spirit is a dangerous and disruptive influence, which few individuals are fitted to control. When it strikes those who are incapable of dealing with it, excesses and enormities are the inevitable consequence. Communalized religion, therefore, imposes on the faithful beliefs and ideals, and, above all, symbolical observances, which possess the property of canalizing and regularizing their chaotic religious impulses and guiding them into beneficial channels. Such a shield may break down either individually or collectively. Individuals who develop their inner world consciousness to a degree which frees them from the collective bondage find the collective religious forms no longer efficacious and are henceforth compelled to find their own individual way of coming to terms with those inner world forces from which they had been hitherto shielded. These, of course, emanating from deep and archaic levels of the unconscious mind, are apt to take forms which are anything but religious in the conventional sense, or the shield may break down in the collective sense, if the current religious system is for any reason discredited. This may occur as a result of abuses, or of some advance of consciousness in another sphere, which makes the traditional beliefs or observances no longer acceptable. When this occurs, the masses are at the mercy of any prophet who succeeds in activating and gaining control of the inner life of the collectivity. Examples of this process are numerous in history. The most recent was the Nazi episode, which was the outcome of the system devised by the prophet Hitler to fill the vacuum left in Germany after 1918 by the discredit into which the pre-war collective system had fallen. This, of course, was not merely a question of religion. Monarchy, capitalism, the military system, all the pillars on which the Second Reich had been built, had collapsed, as well as Christianity in its communal aspect. The latter, however, has long been losing its efficacy as a social force in the more advanced communities, and whatever its importance in the minds of isolated individuals, it is no longer capable of canalizing and directing the forces of the collective unconscious as it did in the Middle Ages. Thus, although, as I observe above, life is considerably simplified for those who never come into conscious contact with the inner world, the price which they pay for this alleviation of the human lot lies in their dependence on the collectivity and their vulnerability to the dangerous side of the mass unconscious. To the Walter Mittys, on the other hand, the inner world is more conscious and hence more real than the outer. Their outlook is predominantly orientated by what they know and experience of it, and to them it is the outer world which lacks reality and inherent validity. When the two come into conflict, it is the outer world which they see as wrong, and instead of adapting their ideas to what they have discovered about it in the course of the collision, they either withdraw from it or seek to alter it in accordance with their ideas of what it ought to be. In the latter case, of course, they may be successful, but only to a limited degree. With their particular capacities and problems we shall be concerned later. We may, however, note at this point that although their attitude complicates life for them in some respects, it may give them, in others, greater adaptability and certainly greater insight than their outer world-orientated fellows. Emphasis on the reality of the inner world. My basic purpose is to insist on the reality of the inner world, not only in the abstract sense in which we say that a star, for instance, is real, although the fact has absolutely no effect on our lives, which would be exactly the same if it were an illusion, but in the same sense it contains forces which do act upon us, and sometimes in a most drastic manner. I am not, of course, contending that the inner world is any more real than the outer, but merely that it is no less real. So great, however, is the contemporary prejudice in favor of the exclusive reality of the outer world, that there is no need to emphasize that it does not possess reality. Rather, it is necessary to depreciate and disparage its importance in order to make a little room in people's minds for the acceptance of the reality of the inner. If A stands in the middle of the hearth, taking all the warmth of the fire for himself and depriving B of his share, then it is necessary to push A aside in order to make room for B. A is still entitled to his half share, but in order to satisfy B's legitimate requirements, it is necessary to start by attacking A. This undertaking is no less necessary for the Walter Mittys than for the extroverts and materialists, for although Mitty in fact undervalues the outer world, he does not understand what he is doing and has nothing adequate to put in its place. Being indoctrinated from his earliest years, like everybody else, with the belief that only the outer world is real, and having acquired from his environment a far richer and completer picture of it than he has of his own province, the inner world, he inevitably tends to interpret the latter in terms of the former, and this may lead to very serious trouble. As we shall see when we come to study the conquerors, the really dangerous men are not the practical and worldly self-seekers, but the doctrinaire and the fanatic who refuse to admit the difference between theory and practice. They are Mittys of a more aggressive and positive type, who are impelled to force their theories and their dreams on an outer world, which they neither value nor understand. Now that the forces of the inner world, the dreams and theories, fears and suspicions, have thermonuclear bombs at their disposal, the question of controlling them has become the question of human survival. The thermonuclear bomb is being developed as a deterrent on the assumption that those who have control of them will never be so utterly deficient of a sense of outer world reality that they will make use of them when they are assured that the inevitable consequence of doing so will be retaliation in kind in the possible destruction of the human race. But can we be assured that those in power inevitably will possess such a well-developed sense of outer world reality? Sir Winston Churchill, in the course of rather complacently announcing to the Commons his government's decision to manufacture such bombs, admitted that the doctrine of the unchallengeable deterrent broke down in the face of the mentality of a Hitler, and certainly there can be no doubt that if this weapon had been perfected 10 years earlier, Hitler would have made use of it. even if he had been assured of the inevitability of retaliation. For in his last months he was bent on destroying as much as he could, inside Germany no less than outside, and he expressly and repeatedly stated that there was no purpose in the German nation's surviving defeat. See Alan Bullock, Hitler, A Study in Tyranny. When we come to examine his motivation, we shall see that it was basically suicidal from the outset, and what could have been a more effective way of achieving a truly gigantic self-immolation? Paradoxical though it may seem, Hitler was a characteristic Mitty, although of the aggressive type. Should anyone say to me, he proclaimed in a speech in 1940, "These are mere fantastic dreams, mere visions," I can only reply that when I set out on my course in 1919 as an unknown, nameless soldier, I built my hopes for the future upon a most vivid imagination. Yet all has come true. My New Order, speech of 10th December, 1940, quoted by Bullock. And Field Marshal Guderian, Chief of Staff of the Army during the last phase of the war, relates that when he attempted to point out the dangers of the situation to Hitler at a conference on the 9th of January 1945, he was met by a hysterical outburst of rage, for, he says, he had a special picture of the world, and every fact had to be fitted into that fancied picture. As he believed, so the world must be, but in fact it was a picture of another world. Quoted from the same source. When we come to examine the career and personality of Hitler in a later volume, we shall see that there was nothing very extraordinary about him until he began making political speeches, and it was the modern apparatus of power which eventually unhinged his mind by finally destroying his always weak sense of the independent reality of the outer world. He, and together with him the German nation and most of the rest of the world, was thus left at the mercy of his personal interpretation of the images of an inner world, the nature of which he did not understand. Is there any guarantee that the same thing will not happen again? I am not advocating that any nation should unilaterally discontinue the manufacture of thermonuclear bombs, apart from the fact that in the present psychological situation, any such exhortations are a pure waste of time. It is my conviction that since these devices exist, it is better to be numbered among those who possess them than among those who do not. For if they are used, nobody will be saved by the fact that he is defenseless. But I do maintain that our only slender chance of survival lies in learning to understand and appreciate the factors at work in the inner world. For it is by this means alone that mentalities of the type of Hitler's may possibly be prevented from developing and attaining power. These two factors, as I have suggested in connection with Hitler, work together, each reacting upon and intensifying the other. Power fantasies lead to a bid for power, and the experience of power encourages in this type of mind the indulgence in yet more grandiose fantasies, which induce a bid for further power, and so on. This question, however, must be postponed for later consideration. The inner world, then, possesses a very high degree of reality in its own right. Wirklich ist was worked. Jung says, that is, real which acts, or which has consequences. In illustration of this, he points out that if a man shoots me because he believes that I am his worst enemy, the fact that his belief happens to be mistaken does not make me any the less dead. The notion in his mind, in fact, was real enough to cause my death, although it bore no relation to the factual situation. Similarly, Hitler's special picture of the world brought about at least 20 million deaths, as well as untold suffering and material losses which have not yet been made good 12 years after his death. It was real enough for that. We shall not succeed in avoiding a repetition of this catastrophe on a still larger scale, by the simple expedient of saying that Hitler was mad. For, in the first place, the ability to win and to hold for 12 years the allegiance of a great and highly civilized nation, and to carry out methodically and consistently a preconceived plan for the conquest of Europe, cannot be covered by any reasonable interpretation of the word mad, and in the second, even if we substitute the more appropriate term irresponsible, we have to accept the fact that if the leading contemporary state can be carried away by such a wave of irresponsibility, we are not justified in assuming, without more ado, that it could not happen to our own or to any other. Germany is not unique. However improbable it may seem that it might happen again, we simply cannot afford to take for granted the supposition that it will not do so, until we have at least made a serious attempt to identify the background and causes of the last outbreak, as we should do in the case of an epidemic of physical illness, and thereby assured ourselves that we understand its causation and can master any tendency to a recurrence. Such an attempt will be made in a future volume. In the meanwhile, I put forward the hypothesis that the question is connected with the contemporary ignorance of the nature of the inner world and its forces. A study of the inner world reveals that its nature can be analyzed and understood, and that its contents are objective and obeys laws in exactly the same way as those of the outer world. The phenomena of Hitler and of Nazism are perfectly intelligible by reference to those laws, and may be regarded as more anomalous and about as usual as an epidemic of cholera used to be. By a concentrated study of the laws of the outer world, we have learnt to understand the nature of cholera, and have largely eliminated it in civilized countries. Why should we not achieve the same control of inner world epidemics? There is no reason why we should not do so, but if we are to be successful, two conditions are indispensable. First, we must persuade ourselves to believe in the reality of the inner world to the extent of being prepared to act upon our conclusions with regard to it with the same conviction and determination as those with which we are prepared to act upon our conclusions regarding the outer world. In other words, we must accept its reality wholeheartedly, and without any tacit reservations of no more than type. Secondly, we must appreciate the fact that it has its own laws, which have little or no relation to the laws of the outer world with which we are so obsessed. Instead of attempting to interpret it in accordance with the latter, which are totally alien to its nature, we must start with a clean slate and an unprejudiced mind to collect appropriate material and to formulate the patterns and tendencies which it reveals. Approach to the problems of the inner mind. To begin with, we must humbly accept the fact of our complete ignorance and ineptitude in this strange world. We must make a modest start by considering in all seriousness what the writer of a disreputable thriller has been able to discover about it. We may reassure ourselves by noting that the conclusions he has reached show significant parallels with stories and myths originating in very different circumstances. From this discovery, it is legitimate to infer that he is dealing with basic problems which have concerned humanity in many different ages and places throughout history. It is true that our material consists so far only of one personal rendering, originating in a mind apparently not particularly profound or widely informed, and presented in a manner which inspires anything but a serious reception of a theme of exceptional profundity and scope. Nevertheless, it is a mind which has adventured into distant regions to which the majority of us lack the enterprise, or perhaps the courage, to penetrate. We must therefore accept what its owner has to tell us of his experiences in the same grateful spirit as that in which we accept the information brought back by travelers into distant lands of which we have little knowledge. However ignorant or superficial they may be in themselves, theirs is the best information available to us. I imagine that Hadley Chase, regarding whose outer world existence and personality I possess no information whatever, is by no means as superficial as a casual reading of No Orchids might suggest. At all events, as I have remarked, there is reason to believe that he is honest about his inner world experiences, for he shirks no unpleasant issues, and is not concerned to foist any false picture of his personality or his values on the reader. The same cannot be said of many novelists, even among the greatest. And finally, there is the richness of symbolical forms which distinguishes his work and reveals the parallels which lead over to other versions of the same theme. No Orchids therefore presents an acceptable starting point for an investigation of the laws and patterns of the inner world. Its comparatively low status in the literary scale increases rather than diminishes this suitability, for its popular success demonstrates that its subject matter has made an immediate appeal to the contemporary collective unconscious. A classic from the past, or a superior work of fiction of the present, the popularity of which was confined to the appreciative few, would lack this advantage, since it might be held that its appeal was based, at least to some extent, on formal literacy or intellectual values, or on prestige. These last are matters with which we are not concerned from the point of view of this study, except as a secondary consideration. The study of no orchids revealed not only the basic theme of the two worlds themselves, but led also to a number of conclusions regarding some of the figures inhabiting the inner world, in other words, its contents, and their typical manner of behavior. Therewith we have taken the first steps in the vast field of study which the inner world represents. A great deal of further investigation, involving many other products of creative fantasy, and the lives of their progenitors, will be required before we can fill in even the broad outlines of the picture thus glimpsed. This work will be the subject of future volumes of this study. For the moment, we are still concerned with the contrast between the two worlds themselves, and with the first of the conditions essential for the mastery of the inner world, which I mentioned earlier, namely the acceptance of a force of reality in the inner world, no less than that which we habitually take for granted in the outer. This question of reality lies at the root of the matter. Our attitude towards the inner world is very largely determined by the extent to which we are prepared to accord the property of reality to its contents. No reasonable person can deny reality, in the sense in which the term is commonly understood, to the outer world and its contents, and civilized thought has succeeded in constructing from them an intelligible, consistent, and serviceable system which excludes that material which I have described as belonging to the inner world. If, therefore, we are to accept reality in the latter, we have to consider the question whether there may exist two different forms of reality, an inner and an outer, in the same way as I have suggested that there are two different forms of truth, the factual and the psychological, which are completely independent of one another. In order to do this, we must first examine the nature of the criteria on which we base our normal everyday discrimination between the real and the unreal, and, secondly, what conscious, half-conscious, or unconscious prejudices we may have in the matter of what we are prepared, on reflection, to accept as reality. This will be the subject of the next chapter.